Whenever our Empress demands a new planet, it always begins with a quick recon of said planet. This time we went over and checked to see what was the potential issue with this planet. Are we going to have trouble taking it? As the Empress demanded, proclaimed, that we shall take the planet in one piece and as many of its inhabitants as possible for her entertainment. We all knew what that meant, but we only cringed at the idea that if we did not do what she commanded, then we would be the ones sent for entertainment as well, and it would not end well for any of us. So we sent our probes. Our probes had a difficult time getting to this third planet from its star, but eventually we got enough probes there so we could figure out what was waiting for us, how to proceed. What we found was a technology level that we kind of laughed at. They were barely into their information age, barely even stepping into their space age, and these silly mammalian bipeds didn't have any idea what was waiting for them. We looked at them as they were simply another species to take. Another species that would easily surrender to our grand might. And as their technology level is what it was, we decided our standard doctrine for their technology level would commence. We sent many of our ships, over 50, to their planet. And as we got close, about the fourth planet's rotation away, we sent several of our scout ships ahead. These were sacrificial ships, considering what needed to be done. And what needed to be done was simple. We could see on our sensors that they had sent other vessels up. These were atmospheric fighters, as they scrambled desperately to burn off some sort of fuel, trying to reach our ships. But it wouldn't matter, as these ships were not even armed. They had one purpose and one person only. They would fly into the atmosphere, separated by a certain degree, and then simply burst out with an EMP. The electromagnetic pulse would go across that sector of the planet and take out all their electronic devices. And once that was done, as the fleet began to move in, they would be sent a message, usually dropped by our aerospace fighters. Messages that they could understand, as we had already figured out their language. The message was simple. You have already been defeated. Surrender or die. This is the technique that we have used on several other different occasions. Now, if they had not reached this level of technology, we would have simply showed up in our ships, and as they brought their own vehicles to bear, we could simply swat them away. But since they had reached this level of technology, we had to make sure that they could not use it against us. So, we moved in. After watching several of those aircraft simply lose their thrust, some of them attempting to glide back to the surface, and in a few cases succeeding quite well, but unfortunately having to land on their bellies. Some, surprisingly, were able to get their landing gear out. We don't know how this was possible, as they should have been simply flying without any instruments. They shouldn't have been able to get their landing gear down, but whatever. We understood that by them being able to do this, they were a species we now craved to have as our underlings. An intelligent species that would work for us would be very, very advantageous, as two of the other empires were looking at ours as possibly the weakest, and we did not want to seem as the weakest, which is why the Empress herself had commanded the taking of this planet as a display of our power. As we got close, we saw that our aerospace fighters were trying to get back to the atmosphere. We tried to reach out to them, but something was happening with the communications. It was difficult to understand them. Something was jamming them. We found out very quickly that this planet was being bombarded with far more radiation than we expected. We had to turn everything up to a level we did not expect as they finally breached through the magnetic sphere and we could finally hear them. And we also got a full count. Well, a count of what was coming back. Many of the communications were screaming how they had been chased away by other fighters that just did not stay on the ground. Ordnance that came from the surface. How was that even possible? Many of this was simply metal slugs that slammed into the side of their vessels, tearing into the heat shields, making it impossible for them to get out of the atmosphere. So they would simply have to stay there and wait on the planet's surface for us to come and retrieve them. For some, this was scarier than anything else, as a foreign planet sometimes had issues waiting for us on there. But we did not see any on our scans as we got closer. Eventually, our ships began to breach through the atmosphere and slowly began to descend. That is when we realized something was wrong. We began to see on our sensors different vessels. They were not the same, yet they still flew. They flew by spinning some sort of strange device in front of them, and they seemed to pull themselves along as they very, very slowly made their altitude. As our ships made it towards the surface of the planet, which from their own lunar orbit to the surface took several of the planet's days to do so, at least safely. Many of these devices came up and we thought that they were simply looking at us. These things were so fragile looking. How could they possibly think they could do any? What the hell was that? And with that, we could see holes begin to open up on the side of our vessels. These things, these little aircraft had come through and started firing some sort of projectile towards us. How could this work? How could any of this work? We just EMP'd their planet. There's no possible way that they could manufacture weapons that quick. How was this even possible? And as our ships began to go towards the surface even closer, within 1 hour of touching down, we began to hear screams coming from vessel number 7. Vessel 7 screamed as their atmosphere had been vented straight off of their bridge. Somehow these creatures had figured out where the bridge was and they were focusing all their fire on it. Holes were opening up on either side and something was flying through. They couldn't figure out what was going on. Were they using some sort of rail guns? This was not possible. We had already electromagnetized their planet. Electronics should not be working. They should only be at the point where their circuitry had gone. How could they possibly get anything up here? We had our weapons stowed specifically because we believed that they would be completely ready to surrender by the time we got to the surface, yet we had still not heard anything. Our disembarkment troops, those meant for subjugation, were already gearing up to get ready to deploy as soon as we touched the surface, but we were just getting buzzed by these things constantly. And as we got closer and closer to the surface, we looked and we could see several other mechanical devices moving. Again, we used an EMP. These things should not be able to operate. How is this even possible? We looked close and a few of them were being pulled by other mechanical devices. Some that were bright orange or green. It was strange to see this. And then we would see them detach themselves manually. How would they figure to do this manually? But that was not the scary part. The scary part that was within 10 minutes of us making planetfall, they began to raise their barrels. They have no electricity. Their motor should not be able to function. How is this possible? The barrels are raising. But what should we worry about? Those laser cannons can't possibly fire. We fried all their electronics. How can they... Why are they smoking all of a sudden? Puffs of smoke had come out and kadoosh! The ship started pushing themselves side to side, rocking from every single impact. Several of the impacts would go inside the ship and then explode. Others would actually pierce clean through from the ventral to the dorsal side. Some were aimed directly at our engines as they were coming down. Others were aimed towards the bridge. but all of them extremely accurate. Some of them coming at with several different almost little metal balls as they burst very close, and these metal balls would puncture our hull. What the heck? I started screaming to the first officer, "Land us now! Get us on the surface! Disembark our subjugation forces. We need to take this planet before anything else happens." I looked over to the sensor array and I realized that not only Ship 7, but 11 had crashed as well. Their bridges were completely destroyed and their engines compartments had been hit and they had simply crashed onto the planet. We were nervous now. As our landing struts came out, we started reaching towards the surface, and constantly we were pushed from one side to the other as each of the impacts, each of the explosions would push us sideways. We had no way of stopping these projectiles from striking our ship and pushing us all around. As we began to get close, we used our point defense cannons to try and target these weapon systems that were firing, but suddenly we realized something else. There was another burst of smoke, but this time it was from a different area of these devices. Something else, and they began to move on their own. How could they do this? What in the ever-loving Maker would give them the power to do this? This was beyond all reason. How could they suddenly begin to move on their own? It was like one right after the other was figuring out how to start up its motors once again and began to move around. But these were not our biggest problem. As our point defense cannons began to fire on anything that they could target, those that were still flying around were easy pickings for any of our point defense cannons, even though they would constantly overshoot. Those that were inside these flying vessels were clearly well skilled, as it took several minutes to knock them all out of the sky, at least those that were still around. Once we started firing at them, they realized that they were outgunned, and they immediately banked away as hard as possible and left the combat zone. We realized now that we had air superiority, and now that we were on the ground, we could finally launch our own fighters. You can't launch them coming through the atmosphere. That's a quick way to destroy the fighters inside the flight deck itself, as simply inertia would make them, as they began to lift off, crash against the ceiling of the ports themselves. We extended the flight deck as far as we could as soon as we were on the ground, as the doors opened on the base to allow the troops to leave. We sent everything out at the same time, still using our point defense cannons as best we could to try and keep anything back. But it was insane. Several projectiles would come over the horizon. Some of them we could pick up with our sensors, breaking the stratosphere, and then suddenly coming down. Well, no matter what we fired at them, they just kept coming. These must have been just falling rocks. Yet when they landed, they exploded with extreme force. One or two of them would land on the far side, and then one or two of them would land close, a whole lot closer to where the enemy was. We couldn't figure out. These gunners must not know what they're talking about. And for a moment, we chuckled. At least we got a reprieve. And then those same rounds would land almost exactly on top of us. Then we realized what they were doing, but it was too late. I ordered everyone off the ship. Everyone. Even the crew to man the ship. Everyone was to get off the ship as soon as possible, but it was almost too late, as all these explosives and everything else started crashing down onto us. It was absolute pandemonium as we all ran towards any exit we could find. In some cases, I ran down the hallway and could see an explosive come through the wall, killing several of my crew. Nothing I could do for them, as the explosive had just thrown them against the side and turned them into chunky salsa. I looked out and I could hear my own troops screaming. Their armor seemed to be ineffective against anything that they were being hit with. We couldn't figure anything out. This was our best armor. There was not a single energy weapon anywhere that could penetrate it with less than 10 strikes in the same area. This organic armor was designed specifically to stop anybody from taking us down, and yet I could see through the crack in our armor that the armor on the soldiers didn't do any good. Whatever they were being struck with was ripping parts of them off as our blood started spraying the ground. And then another volley of explosives hit, and I didn't have time to worry. Many of the crew did not make it out as these explosives continued to rain down on the ship. Those in charge of each of the group were telling all their soldiers to spread out away from the ships, get them away. I no longer had comms with any of the other ships. I just hoped that possibly we got enough of our own into the air to keep their own suborbital forces away from us, but it was absolute chaos. By the time the explosives had stopped several minutes later, I looked around and only half of our 300,000 had made it off the ship. They all began to push farther out, but as they did, more and more of these strange pops in the distance would happen, and then another one would scream as though they were hit. Some didn't even have a chance to scream as their head would simply explode. We found out very quickly that the louder the pop, the more gruesome it was. It was horrible. We thought we had faced the worst of it. We were wrong. It was before nightfall that we could see and hear several things off in the distance. We pulled up our infrared and we could see that several vehicles were coming over the hills. Off in the distance through the valleys, we could hear them and we could see lights moving around, but we could not get a good view. We should have left a few ships out in space to look over. We hoped that we would be able to get our distress call out. One of the ships must have sent a distress call. Our communications array was hit far beyond the time before we realized that we were so deep in the wastewater that we did not have a chance. Our only chance now was to take a large enough section of this planet to force their surrender. So we took ours and we continued out. We grabbed as many supplies as possible and we began to push out in every direction, but it seemed like for every single meter of this planet, the locals wanted to fight us, and it wasn't long before finally one of the soldiers brought the body of one of the locals to us, and I got a good look at it. This bipedal thing, I couldn't tell what caste it was from. It wore some strange garments, but as we checked it out, we realized that it was not truly organic. There was some different types of polymers in it. It was strange. You would think something that would be fighting in a forested area like this would be wrapped up in something that looked like the forest itself, but its legs were covered in a blue fabric, and its top, the top didn't even go down its above limbs. It was strange. It only stopped about a third of the way down, maybe less. And yet it was also a type of, it was black, but it was almost gray with some sort of strange writing on it. I asked the commander of the party that found it, did it have anything on it? They said yes, it had this, and it showed us a strange metal device. We looked and had it scanned as well. This strange device that it was holding was simply metal and wood. We began to look through trying to analyze it, and eventually we were able to open it up, and a strange thing popped out. It was almost gold in its look. When we scanned it, it was a type of brass. As we scanned it even closer, we realized that inside was some sort of chemical, and then we realized what was happening. They had projectile weapons. That was the sound we heard. Now we knew what we were facing, but unfortunately we didn't have much to go against them. But we could change our tactics, and we did. We began trying to use the local fauna to be able to move ourselves without being struck by these projectiles, but oh, these locals were good. You would hear the shot, and it would take several moments before their projectile would strike. Again, for every meter, they fought us. We continued out, and we did begin to get several hectares of land in every direction around the ship. as we waited until the sun rose the next morning, as it was difficult for even our sensors to see through the darkness of the foliage at night. We could hear things moving around. Strange things. Strange noises. Was this the locals? We didn't know what it was. Was that a call to arms? Everyone was set behind their weapons and ready. Everyone's nerves on full alert. Every once in a while firing into the darkness as they believed they saw something moving. We didn't see anything. We couldn't figure out what it was. Anything around us. But we could still see the lights off in the distance moving around. We knew that most likely they would be coming at us, but when, we didn't know. It was a long night. It was a very long night. Our nights are only 17 standard hours. Theirs are 31 standard hours. We would find out later that the humans say, it's the middle of summer, it's only 6. Strange people. But before we had a chance, and just at the first glimmer that the sun may be rising again, everyone extremely exhausted from being alert all night, the sounds that came from the woods. We could hear the sounds of machines moving through. We could hear the sounds of people moving around. We looked to see where they were coming from, and as soon as we heard the first shot, we knew we were in trouble. The first shot was a loud and thunderous boom, and we saw this bright shine come through. It took several moments before it arced over and struck our main lines, and behind that was another smaller weapon that came from the same device. This thing on tracks got closer and closer, firing its main weapon over and over again. Flanked on either side were more of them. How could they possibly get them running? We hit them with the EMP. This should be an easy cleanup. But that was not the worst. Even though we could able to hold them at a standstill with our heavy weapons and the point defense systems, that is when we realized we were truly, truly wrapped helically. As we looked up, we could hear something in the sky. Our fighters, we could see bank off into the distance. I tried to reach for the comms to find out what was going on, and then suddenly we saw streaks of smoke go across the sky, and before our fighters could even get away, they struck our fighters, and they all exploded in masses of fire. It wasn't but a few moments later that the enemy air forces had come in mass. The original in-atmosphere fighters that we thought that we had taken down had taken flight once again, and they came in and hit our ship again with everything they could, striking not only with things that explode, but with things that burn. And with that, I started to scream into our communications on a broadband that we surrender. We surrender. I do not want to watch my people get slaughtered in a useless battle. We surrender. It must have fallen on deaf ears as the battle raged for over an hour and a half more, but eventually the weapons went silent. As we dropped our weapons and held there, dropping down to our knees and sticking our hands, all 4 of them, to the sky in this universal sign of surrender, we saw for the first time what we truly had faced. Several of their vehicles rolled up to us on some sort of track that was underneath. Each of them had a different type of large cannon out the top and a small cannon next to it, but walking next to them were all sorts of bipeds holding all sorts of weapons. They simply walked over and started asking us questions, but we couldn't understand it until we adjusted our translator. Eventually, we found out they were asking who was in charge, and I surrendered myself. I told them that I would follow their direction as is our law. As I was interrogated by one of their commanders, I simply had to ask, how did they survive the EMP? That should have knocked their technology completely away. They seemed to find this amusing, as they told us, well, you clearly don't know humanity. We don't need technology to kill you. All we need is a rock. We were confused on this. But you did not strike us with rocks. Nope, but a bullet works just as good. We were confused again. A bullet? With that, he pulled out his weapon from his side, pulled out a small piece of metal from the base, and then pulled out another small piece of metal. This one I recognized as the gold-colored piece that we had found with the propellant. He simply looked at me as I showed recognition, and he smiled. You get it now? I simply raised my shoulder and then lowered it again. He did not understand the gesture, but I was agreeing with him. He simply put that same piece of metal in that long piece of metal he had taken out, and then put that other piece of metal back into his weapon with a click, and then put it back into the side. He did not seem to be agitated at all. It would be almost one of our years before we finally had an answer to why the EMP did not work and why it seemed that they had been miraculously able to fight us. As it turns out, this species seems to enjoy warfare a lot. They enjoy it so much that they hold on to relics of the past. It is no surprise that Ship 11 and 15 and 16 had failed, as all they had to do was manually turn their large guns from their large ships and fire them into ours. Our ships were not designed to take that type of punishment, and they simply crashed into the ground. Around the entire world, our forces were knocked out of the sky by weapons that these creatures had not used to fight each other in almost 70 of their years. It scares me. It scares me more than the wrath of the Empress to know that we had now allowed them to capture our ships and capture our technology. Now they had weapons that were state of the art. What could these creatures do with those? Oh, shit. It has been almost 3 decades since the Cluckodon dropped onto our planet. 3 decades since at first they thought they could take us down by shooting an EMP wave across this planet. 3 decades since they realized that we do not screw around, and 3 decades since they learned you can die if somebody tries hard enough. And in those 3 decades, we have secured their ships, their technology. We have learned everything from them, reverse engineering all that we can. Many of our cities were still intact. Our industry took off like a shot because we wanted to build our new ships, our new weapons. Of course, humans being humans, we always competed with each other. Some states, some countries, some regions banded together so that they could actually create things much, much faster and have their own fleets, as of course everyone feared that human nature itself would turn on itself. However, there was one mitigating factor that would stop this in its tracks, and that was very simple. The fact that we have a common enemy. This enemy has one major issue. They have pissed us off. I was very young when they first showed up on our planet, but that doesn't have much to do with the fact that their technology, in particular, their energy technology, does something strange to the human physiology. My uncles, my father, my grandfathers, my mothers, grandmothers, everybody looks young. It's strange. We don't know what that energy field that comes off with. Some sort of, and I'm still learning this, some sort of quantum flux torsion dual something. I don't know. Physics was never really my thing. I have trouble figuring it out. I'm a little bit better with chemical engineering than anything else, but hey, to each their own. We're all wired different. And that's one of the reasons why their EMP shit didn't work. When they dropped it on, they didn't realize that a lot of our technology was already EMP resistant. Most of our fighters simply left. If the EMP was strong enough, of course, it's still going to shock the equipment. But it wasn't enough to actually make them plummet to the earth. And of course, ejection seats still work. They're manual. All in all, most of our aircraft had actually gotten back to the ground. A good thing too, because F-22s are expensive. And the last thing we need is those suckers just falling out of the sky by the hundreds. But all in all, when it was all said and done, they couldn't get off our planet because we had just simply swarmed them with old technology, sometimes digging out old tech as far as World War II, as many of those aircraft were what held the line at first until the rest of our fighters got refit just enough where they could resist the EMP shockwave if it happened again. We didn't think they'd fire the shockwave as it would fire into their own ships once inside our magnetosphere. They did send those probes and everything to do it, so it is what it is, of course. But as we developed everything, our fighters went from 5th and 6th generation to 7th and 8th and even 9th generation in about a decade. The advancements in technologies worldwide was absolutely insane. Most of us don't have to worry about anything like survival anymore. Hygiene is taken care of, and the population of the planet has somewhat stabilized. Now, there are some places that still refuse to use the technology, but let's just say you only have to have kids if you want to. Though this turned the species very hedonistic for about a decade, and of course vanity is always going to be a thing, there was still the issue that we had our own common enemies. And we would all join together to make sure that they would face the wrath of humanity itself. Eventually, our leaders figured out the star charts and got everything lined up and figured out a battle plan. The best battle plan. The best way to deal with the enemy that had come to our shores. And with those 3 decades of preparation, we were ready to stretch out. As we would reach out beyond our own sector, our own solar system, for the first time, many of our own decided to try and colonize other planets as well. Many of the ships they made were not warships, but instead colonization ships as they headed straight towards our neighbors. One that was solid red as it was covered in all sorts of metals that could be used, and the other one which was basically an acid-filled washing machine. It didn't matter. They were going to terraform them both. Luna had already several bases on them, and the humanity came together like never before. As the first colonies were going to reach Jupiter and Saturn, the fleet left and I was with them. I had joined on just to make sure that this was taken care of. Being a chemical engineer, we figured out the different types of elements that their ships were made out of, and also what the aliens were made out of. We had created not really a super virus, but something that would, well, if you pardon the pun, give them a real bad case of the shits. And then, they wouldn't exactly crap themselves to death, but they wouldn't be exactly in fighting shape either. It was actually kind of funny to watch them kind of do a strange type of crab walk over towards the latrine so they could relieve themselves. Once their body got to a certain point, they simply would pass out from dehydration. And then they wouldn't be fighting anybody. I wondered if this was going to be something we would use because I knew what the battle plan was. And as we jumped into FTL speeds, I felt the first ping of nausea as suddenly I realized our bodies were not meant to do this. But again, as a chemical engineer, I simply took the pills, or some people opted for the shot, and then off we went to the races. With the new technology and the new chemical engineering, we were able to make sure the human body does not degrade in the vacuum of space. Not to mention, with the technology of artificial gravity, we could simply lighten the gravity to ease off the pressure of our joints, allowing us to get a little bit taller, but not having the super pressure and allowing our hearts to not degrade like it would in 0G. It was a great way of doing things. It would take approximately 2 months to reach their home planet. This also was a long way because, well, we had to dodge a few of their other worlds. We had one target and one target in mind. As we got close, everyone got to their action stations. I might be an engineer, but I still had to help out if the battle turned into a furball. As we jumped into their sector, we saw that many of their ships had started to turn towards us. We had not gone unnoticed. Oh crap. I looked at the radar and I could see that our fleet was getting into position, a standard spindle formation to allow us to maximize our firepower. And with that, we got ready to fire our first large weapon. In unison, every single one of the ship opened up and charged up a strange weapon. The enemy had not seen this before, and we simply fired the burst towards their planet. We knew this wouldn't actually damage the planet as it wouldn't be able to breach through their own magnetosphere, but it did a number on their ships. And their ships were simply adrift in space as the wave of electromagnetic pulse flared across space and opened like a giant cone. It looked almost like a solar flare if you turned your resonance just a little bit so that you could see the pulse wave. It was beautiful. It was beautiful to see each of the enemy ships getting ready as their weapons began to turn and track us, and then all of a sudden they would simply start drifting sideways. We paid them no mind and just kept a watch on them as we continued on towards their planet. We could see other ships trying desperately to get outside their planet to try and help their own. We sent them a radio call, and it was very simple. Fire at us and you die. How about you go help your friends instead? They understood this, and the ships that actually broke the surface and got out past their own lunar orbit, well, of their 2 moons, that is, their second lunar orbit, they just bypassed us and went straight towards their own ships to try and get the crew. Without any type of power, they only had maybe 4 or 5 hours if they were lucky before either they ran out of air or they ran out of time. And by that, I mean they would either freeze or they would fry. Not a nice thing. Like my first instructor said, there's a million ways to die in space, and they all suck. Hopefully, for their case, they don't open up a bulkhead and then it would truly suck. We continued on towards the enemy planet. They began to send all sorts of threats and then cries for mercy when they realized that their fleet was completely taken apart, was completely useless as it floated there in the void. We got close to them, and then we began to surround their planet. I would have no doubt that they were getting ready for an orbital bombardment or for us to drop transports down to the surface so that we could take their planet as a whole. We caught a few transmissions as they desperately called for reinforcements from any of their other colonies, but they never got a response. I guess they figured if the home fleet was taken out so quickly, what was the point? And as we finally got in position, most of us were almost giddy at what was going to happen next. The enemy could only stare up at the sky as many large cylinders were dropped from the ships. Not launched, but dropped. All you have to do is release them towards the gravity well and let gravity do the work for you. As these cylinders plummeted through their atmosphere, they all must have probably looked at them as nuclear devices, something to glass their planet, something to end their life as they know it. Well, they're half right. As they reached approximately 35,000 feet, they exploded, each of them across the planet. And again, changing the spectral analysis on my screen, I could see the blast wave, a massive EMP, easily 30 times stronger than what they had hit us with, radiated across their planet from each of the cylinders. They were simply EMP bombs. They spread out across with such force that even anything that was protected in a Faraday cage was not fully protected. The EMP would radiate down even a mile and a half below the surface. That's how many electrons were being shoved down into that planet. And we watched on the screen as many of their vehicles, seemingly hover vehicles, simply dropped the meter to the ground. Violently, too, just boom, hitting the ground. This didn't seem to hurt anyone. It simply just brought everything to a halt. We then sent another group of cylinders down. This one, as it got towards the surface, seemed to turn. It looked more like a drone. It popped wings, and as it went across each of the population centers, each of these drones began to drop simple leaflets. Each of these leaflets had a simple message. Payback's a bitch. We waited another 48 hours before we did the same thing. We dropped another bunch of leaflets. The leaflets stated simply, "Leave us alone." Behind this was a whole bunch of shuttles that came down from most of our transport ships. Inside the shuttles were those that we had caught before, as they were no longer of any use to us. As our shuttles landed, the doors opened, and the former prisoners were basically thrown out, shoved out as fast as possible. We didn't care about being nice, as they had come to our planets to invade, but not to destroy. And as our shuttles left, we got ready to leave their home planet. Now, many throughout history would most likely judge us by saying, "Why didn't you just glass their planet? Why didn't you just exterminate the species?" Well, the fact is, we were going for more poetic justice. You see, they did not come to our planet to annihilate us. They came to capture us. And showing that we could do the exact same to them was enough of a warning. Especially since, by our best estimates, it would take them another 50 of their years, basically their own lifespan, to actually build their planet back up to what it was before we showed up. On our way out, we scanned their vessels, those that were still adrift in space. Most of them had been cleared out of all potential life. And when we got aside each of them, we harpooned the sides and grabbed their ships. We got on board and confirmed that there was no one left. They had done their job and they had secured their own folks. The only thing that their species had now on their planet that had any power were the few ships that they had sent up to recover their own people. Thankfully, they weren't stupid enough to try us on, as we outnumbered them easily 4-1. Not to mention, we were able to check their weapon systems, and it was kind of funny how ineffective they would have been. If there's one thing we're good at, it's making things that go boom and things that shoot really far and really straight. I hope they keep this in mind as we captured their ships, strapped them onto ours, and then jumped in the FTL space, making sure that they had nothing left but just their own planet. Maybe, just maybe, when they pull themselves back up by their bootstraps, they'll be a little smarter. If not, you could always use my invention and give them a real bad case of the shits. After their defeat at the hands of the humans, the species known by said humans as Species 02 was left bare to defend against all others coming at their species. The galactic forces are many, and they reach out amongst the stars far beyond anyone's expectations. It can be several sectors of nothing, and then you run into an entire armada, an entire empire, simply waiting for the chance to expand. And that is what happened. Species 02 withdrew their forces, those what they were fighting against, and they ran back to their home planet to try and salvage everything. And while salvage operations were going on, another species, another one that is barely able to be spoken by the human tongue, but as close as they get is clearly the human voice was not meant to do this, so they would be simply called Species 03 eventually. 03 looked up at 2 and simply laughed. They saw that they had no fleet maintaining around their planet. They barely had their industries functioning again and were using their own ships to try and power residential areas to try and keep them from starving. They were desperate. And Species 03, this new little species that was akin to what humans would call a goblin or a halfling, was simply ready to strike. Though they did not physically hold any power, it was simple for them to rush onto the planet and simply fire the same way. EMPs were a common use tactic, and they simply EMP'd the last of the ships, and as they shut down the power, the rest of the planet was easy pickings. Many of Species 02 simply surrendered, as they did not have the will or the power, or energy for that matter, to fight. Most of their weapons were offline, and many of their logistics were just not there. Many of them simply gave themselves into slavery as long as their children were fed and maintained with some sort of medical care. These goblin-looking 03s took a modicum of pity and did simply take the species. I would not say they saved them, but they did take them and put them under their, non-existent wings. They moved on again and began to stretch over 02's territory and simply took over without much contention at all. And while doing this, they tried to figure out how Species 02, a strong species, one that could easily hold against them, was defeated and left back in their own Stone Age, barely holding on. How could this have happened? Who or what could have taken them? And they were given the message. They were told that a species called a human had showed up. A species that they had tried to fight before. A species that they tried to make slaves to fight Species 03. But 03 laughed at this idea. How could a slave species fight you? How could they possibly stand up against an entire armada? How could they possibly fight once they themselves were sent back to the Stone Age? Species 02 stayed quiet. They simply said that the humans were cunning, and they had a way of sabotaging things. But as long as they had decent protection in their software, they would be fine. 03 simply made plans. They realized that if a species this powerful was out there, it was a threat to them, and they brought it to their empress. Their empress mulled it over for a little while, listened to her benefactors, and also listened to her, we can say their cabinet. Those who would help her out, those who would have her ear, simply told her it would be a simple matter to rally the fleet and take this human's homeworld. They completed the plans to take the human's homeworld in a matter of months. There was a lot of planning to be done, along with the logistics of taking their new servant caste with them. The new servant caste would be used as cannon fodder, seeing that they wanted to take revenge on the humans. Not to mention, Species 03 was not physically able to go toe-to-toe with humans. so they would simply use the others to do that. They believed the humans would simply fall apart in face of an enemy that could rip them up if faced hand-to-hand combat. Many of Species 02 were scared of this, but they kept their fears in check. They realized that the subterfuge was required if they wanted to survive from this, so they simply went along with it. It took 7 human years for them to rebuild a fleet large enough that they could finally face off against the humans. They would go in and make sure that the humans would be stopped cold right where they were, and then the humans will be brought to heel and become another subjugated race. They would fall prey to 03 and their relentless tide of warfare and conquest, as that is what their entire species was designed for. Though they did not have the physical strength of most, they simply wanted more, and their avarice held no bounds. It would take years of planning and preparation to be ready to invade human space. Many of us worried what would be waiting for us inside human space, as we knew what the humans were capable of. We looked at ourselves sometimes and realized that our 4 arms may outnumber theirs, but we looked at the size and depth and width of theirs, and they seemed to be solid muscle. It was scary to see. These seemingly hairy brutes were something else entirely, something that we were not interested in facing again. So underlying plans were made even before the ships left for human space. Well, what do we have here? Sir, we got contacts. Send it. What do you got? We got another invading fleet, sir. Really? Well, that's been a while. How long has it been? 10 years? 20? 18, sir. Well, what's their composition? Heading our way, they are outside Jupiter orbit, and they're heading our way fast, approximately 4 days. They'll be within firing range in 2. Alright, you got it. Sound general quarters, and let's get this show on the road. The humans had not been idle the whole time. Humanity itself was getting ready the whole time because they knew, after checking out all the ships that they had taken, that the galaxy at large was full of species that demanded all sorts of conquest. The right of conquest may be universal, but most of humanity realized how stupid it was considering how few of us there were. I mean, seriously, we're down to only a handful of billion, and they got trillions to work with and several planets. It'd be like, say, South Korea trying to take on the entirety of the world. Even if they had 6th gen weaponry, it wouldn't have mattered. You just have to be ready for what's coming. And humanity was ready. As the fleet began to advance towards space, several coded messages came out. Several underlying messages that many human ships got, but these were tight beam transmissions. Many of the comms officers were not sure if they were getting what they were hearing, but they started to decipher them. Inside the message was a plan that made many human captains and admirals smile. Although it would make the ground pounders not very interested in what was going on, they knew that this plan would work. With this, the human fleet, even though it would only take about 2 days to come together and protect Earth itself, pulled back to the outer colonies, pulled back to Mars and Venus, pulled back also to Io. Some of them even just hid behind Luna and waited. This was something that they needed to do. As the ships got closer, a message came out from those of Species 03. Surrender or die. one of the admirals was quoted on saying, "Can they think of something original for a change? I'm tired of this bullshit." This got a laugh from his entire crew and anyone who was listening. With that, a message came straight from the planet itself, and the message was simple. You want us? Come and get us. And with that, the alien fleet seemed to crank their engines up 3 times faster and immediately got closer, leaving several of the older ships behind. Most of these happened to be from Species 02. And Species 02 seemed to be falling more and more behind as things continued. Species 03 didn't care. They believed that they had more than enough to take the planet, as they'd only caught a few small echoes of different ships off in areas that were not even close to where they were heading. They were heading straight towards Earth, and nothing would stop them. They commanded that all the ships stay together with the flagship, but the flagship had some of the strongest engines out there. It was impossible for even their destroyers to keep up, and their destroyers are designed for speed. It was absolutely crazy. But the Empress demanded, and she took special interest in this planet and in this species. She wanted to see them. She wanted to make them pets. She grinned at this idea, that large, toothy grin, as she looked over at the Empress of 02, as she sat there beside her, head down, in submission. The large, thin body of 02's Empress simply sat there, seemingly waiting, seemingly shamed at what was going on. And the Empress of 03 simply smiled even larger, believing her conquest was complete. As they got just outside lunar orbit, they sent another message to humanity. We have come here to take you. You will surrender now, or we will simply destroy your entire species and take your planet as our trophy. Think of your families, think of your people, and surrender peacefully, or you will leave us no choice but to destroy all of you. You have until we reach your planet to decide. With that, she didn't even slow her fighter down. That damn ship was moving so fast. She had her fleet spread out way behind her, as some just could not keep up with the amount of Delta V she was pushing. As she got within lunar orbit, she received a message, this time from down on the surface. This is the voice of humanity. We implore you to turn around and leave our sectors immediately. If you do not, we will be forced to respond with lethal force, and we cannot guarantee the safety of your people, your ships, or yourself. We understand that the Empress is on board, and we do not wish to destroy you, as that would mean all-and-out total war between our two species. So I ask you to think about your own species now, and turn around. With that, the Empress laughed, this hoarse chuckle of a laugh, laughing so hard that her ribs began to hurt, and simply got on the communications and sent her message. You do not dictate to me, human. You have just signed your own death warrant. If you even survive this, I will make you my pet, my personal pet, so that you may lick the mud off my shoes every day. And I will keep you alive long enough to see your own descendants do the same. Lay down your weapons or die. There was only a few moments of hesitation. It's your funeral. Come and take them, bitch. That last word did not translate at all, but she understood that it was meant to be an insult. She immediately ordered that all ships be ready. Send everything down to the surface. Take them all. If they end up injured or wounded, finish them off. The rest I want in cages before the next solar rotation. That gave them about a year She obviously didn't understand what humans can do if you give them a year. But they would not need it. As the shuttles began to go towards the surface, many of the ships seemed to hesitate to launch the shuttles. This was odd. This was very odd. Communications went out to hurry up and start dropping their shuttles to their locations, and yet the main ship dropped everything they could. It was almost like a flurry of wasps that were heading towards the surface. As they did, several things happened at once. All of a sudden, any of the ships commanded by a 02 simply turned and bolted away from the main group. If they were anywhere close, they began to give covering fire to those that were trying to evacuate the area. Any 03s that were in those ships were immediately taken out. The 02s didn't want anything to do with humanity, not this time. But they would more than willing shoot the 03s, shoot them in the back if that's what necessary. But the 03's mothership was more than well armored, more than well armed, as it began to fire on the 02s as they ducked and dodged and dived all they could, just trying desperately to not get hit, many of them getting blasted to pieces as they tried to get away. A communication would go out later about this, but as they did, the humans started to make their appearance. All their ships began to jump in from FTL, but they didn't use standard FTL, which confused the living crap out of their new enemy. They jumped, as in they were one point at one point, and then in another point at another point in time. This was technology they didn't understand, but suddenly their own gunners didn't even have time to react as the main guns of the human fleet began to chew into the outer edge of theirs. The humans were severely outnumbered, but it didn't matter. They just kept firing. The 02s also joined the fray as they began to blast into the enemy ships, any that were given pursuit. Missiles, energy weapons, torpedoes, rail guns, Gauss rifles, you name it, it was in the air at that point. There was even a strange pulse of energy that seemed to fly out of several of the human main battleships as it slowly made its way. You would think it would move at light speed, but it seemed as though whatever was trying to hold it together was barely containing it as it sparked on its way there. Many of the ships didn't know what it was, but simply tried to fire at it, but every time they hit it with an energy weapon, it seemed to grow larger and stronger and more dense. Before they had a chance to fire it with point defense weapons, it struck the first amount of ships and simply burst across them, leaving a strange blue, green, and pink spray of energy that seemed to envelop the side of the ship. The side of the ship seemed to melt away under the intense heat, and even as the energy started to pull away, the ship itself seemed to buckle and wince as many of the outer hull sections began to blow open as they were now liquid. If any of the engines were hit, they would simply explode in a massive fireworks display. Now, the 03s were in a pinch. They were caught on all sides. Those that were right behind them so they could not escape was the 02s. They had them stuck. They couldn't jump to FTL speed. They couldn't get away. They were too close to any gravity well. They were even too close to the moon. They couldn't even pull away. You need to be far enough away from a gravity well for FTL to function. It is just a commonality of space. But somehow the humans had managed to do this without having to worry. Though if they had seen the inside of the ship, as many of the crew was rocked off to one side as they jumped in, and the gravity suddenly yoinked them off to the side of the ship, many of them breaking bones, ripping tendons, and unfortunately a few fatalities due to this. But it still got them close enough to bring their main weapons to bear, and they were firing everything. Humanity did not stop. They just continued to fire. Their weapons could be seen running hot, but they didn't seem to care. Their reactors were running hot. They didn't seem to care. They just kept firing. The 02 saw this and realized this was how humanity won. This is how humanity had beat them, over sheer tenacity of not surrendering when they were told. It was a giant human fuck you. On the surface, it wasn't much better. As it could be seen from the surface, a whole bunch of ships blowing up as much ordnance was flying in left, right, and center. On the ground, it wasn't much better. As the shuttles came down, they were inundated with all sorts of ordnance, guided missiles, dummy munitions. Some of the largest cannons ever created in the universe were sitting on the planet's surface and using electromagnetic pulses simply to rocket a huge piece of metal right into the air. Not only would it do that, but it would burst out. As it turns out, these were flechette rounds, and they would simply bury themselves inside all the shuttles, blowing in giant holes in each side. And most of them would simply barrel roll as they lost all sorts of power. Their anti-gravity motors simply failing, or the pilot was hit, or they would simply rip open the sides. It didn't matter. It was simply a bloodbath as they fell to the ground. Those inside the Empress's ship could see the percentages of loss: 8%, 11%, 13%, 17%, 21%. The numbers just kept going up as they watched the shuttles reaching for the surface. They believed that the humans didn't have any air power left. They were wrong. As they went down, they tried what they could, and they tried to fire an EMP blast again. It didn't work. The first shuttles were actually decoys and did try this, but this didn't even slow the humans down. The humans had learned, and every piece of their equipment was shielded from this site of attack. Even those that were in civilian attire, who simply held weapons, looked at their electronic devices and went, eh. If the Species 03 had known this, they might have packed up and left at that point, but the Empress was stubborn. She still screamed at them to take this planet. Take them all down. I don't care. Kill them all if you have to. And they tried. God help them, they tried. Around the planet, all sorts of aircraft screamed in well beyond visual range as they fired all sorts of ordnance towards any type of fighter, any type of shuttle that was coming down, leaving many of them to be hit and fall in a giant ball of flames, hitting the ground and exploding in a massive fireworks display. Others that got to the ground found themselves not able to even get out the doors, as they would lower the doors trying to get out, and all you would hear is the unbelievable loud sound of projectiles being fired into the doorway. Many of them, as soon as they stepped in the doorway, were hit with several, what seemed like 8 or 9 ball bearings at the same time, causing them to go flying back, their small bodies unable to take this type of pressure, and would simply explode half the time. This made many of their strongest soldiers piss their pants. Many of them, by the time they even got out, realized that they were severely outnumbered and severely outgunned. Though they had put down almost 1 billion of their soldiers in the first wave, only about half of them had reached the surface, and even less of them had been able to reach their targeted area. Many of them were under fire even before they fully landed. On rare occasion, they would even come at them with what seemed to be the most primitive of weapons: fire. In one case, they landed inside a city, able to land right inside a green area, one of the only green areas in this entire city, but it was the only place they could land. And as they did, a human ran up at them with some sort of metal. No, that wasn't metal. That was glass. It was on fire. And now they throw it. It landed right on the cockpit and burst into flames. The fire suppression system kicking on inside, believing that the flames were on the inside instead of the outside, fogging out the inside of the cockpit and making it impossible to fly. Even if they wanted to take off, they couldn't. If they tried, they had more chance of actually crashing into a building. So they simply tried to evacuate, and that is when, as soon as the door opened, another one of these glass containers flew inside on fire. A few of them saw it. It was almost like in slow motion as it went right past their heads, hit the far wall, and then burst into flames, spreading flame all over the inside of the cabin. Many of them running out screaming as their suits and clothing were on fire, rubbing themselves on the ground, screaming in pain. The humans would come up and immediately just start stomping on them, not trying to put the fire out, but trying to kill them instead. Many of them pulling out small blades that they had on their person and simply stabbing each of the new invaders. It was this way across the entire planet. And on planet, everyone suffered. The falling debris, usually from hit shuttles as they came screaming in from up in space, would smash into areas and set everything on fire. Those that were on the ground, the civilians, tried desperately to quell the flames, but as soon as the engine exploded, it would take several humans with it. This was the only thing that the Empress ever saw that made her glad. She believed this was the only way to handle them, so she believed that they needed better demonstration. She ordered that the ship be moved over a different area, a populous area that didn't have a lot of her own people in it, and they would simply end everyone in that area. They were going to glass the planet. As they began to move the ship into position, it was still bouncing left and right, as each time it tried to get a lock on to where it wanted to fire, another large piece of ordnance would slam into it. In one case, they could hear a clang on the side of the throne room, which doubled as a bridge. One of those rail guns, coil guns, or whatever the hell you want to call it, had flown in, breached both levels of the hull, and pierced so far into the heart of the ship that it now made a visible dent on the side of the bridge. This is when the Empress realized she might be in trouble. If they could strike her, then they could strike her. And in her mind, she was the only one that mattered. This was the moment when she realized that she was in a bit of trouble, but then ordered, it didn't matter where they were aiming the ship, just fire and kill these damn monkeys. And with that, the ship began to fire, but then found itself being struck in the weapons array just a few moments later with everything, to include several of those strange blue balls of whatever in the hell was flying across space. They melted the guns, and the weapons array would overheat and explode, jerking the ship violently to one side. My Empress, our weapons, our main weapons are gone. That can't be real. How could they take out so many? I don't know, but they're not responding, my Empress. Finally, she looked down for the first time since the battle had truly started at the other Empress of Species 02. And she looked up, and she was now smiling. You knew this would happen. She continued to smile without saying a word. Reaching down, she grabbed onto the throat of the Empress of 02. Tell me how you survived this. She simply stayed silent until the Empress of 03 reached with both hands and started shaking her. Tell me, or I will have you executed right here. The Empress of 02 calmly looked at her, raised herself up so she was eye to eye with 03, and said, We lost. They were just nice enough not to kill us all. That is when the Empress of 03 truly felt fear. She slowly let go of the throat of 02, stepped back a little bit in shock, as everyone in the bridge was still screaming orders, trying desperately to figure out a way to come out on top. And then suddenly there was a huge jerk, and the Empress was sent flying across the room, her small body slamming against the stairs and falling down. She simply raised her head and yelled, Report! With that, every station started screaming how bad it was. Most of their ships had been taken down. Most of their shuttles were just not returning at all. If they even made it back, they were simply blown apart. They could barely make it out of the magnetosphere without totally collapsing. Even if they did make it out, they didn't realize that they were not structurally sound, and many of the crews simply choked as they suddenly ran out of air. They could actually hear a few of the shuttles crashing into the ship with a light thud. Clang, 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 as they would simply bounce and then end up plummeting back towards the surface. Get us out of here, she screamed to everyone. And then she got the worst answer ever. We can't, ma'am. They got our engines. We're adrift and we can't get them. Ma'am, the part, they're gone. The engines are blown off. The Empress then ran over to the comms area and started staring at each one and saw that everything had gone bad. Everything was wrong. Everything was done. Those that were on the ground were over 90% losses. Those ships that were there were down to barely 13%, and she watched it click down to 12% as she saw. With that, her own ship adrift, the pride of her navy, she simply turned the comms on and ordered everyone to stand down. The battle was over. In space and on the surface, weapons went silent. The capture of prisoners, the care of those that had been damaged, injured, were taken. The Empress was in the throne room, sitting on her throne, as she saw several humans entered, all of them in large suits. These suits seemed to be atmospheric suits. She simply stood up and began to address them in the royal way. The humans didn't seem to understand what the hell she was saying, as she stated her full name and rank, and that she was there to surrender. They didn't even care. They walked over to the Empress of 02, saw that she was still bound to the wall, pulled out a strange device, and cut her loose. With that, she reached up to all 4 of her wrists and began to check. They were slightly damaged, but usable. She stood up, and this was the first time she realized how large the humans actually were. Though similar in height, only separated by barely a few centimeters, and the Empress of 02 was tall for her species. They both loomed over her. With that, one of the humans scaled up the stairs and looked the Empress right in the eyes before stepping even further as he loomed over her frame, her squat frame that was simply only about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. He turned his head slightly sideways and then turned it back the other way, again sideways. She could hear as though it was speaking, but she couldn't understand what it was saying. She then heard the other one, slight muffling from inside their helmets, and she realized that they were speaking to each other. Then the human simply looked at something on its arm, some sort of readout, and then, confirming what it saw, clicked the button, shut it off, and then raised the front of its helmet. "So you're the Goblin Queen, huh? Come with us." Humans eyed their new, uninvited guests with a lot of suspicion, although there were many smirks, many side comments, many different things being said. It's a good thing they didn't understand the human languages, or they might be a little pissed off at what was said. The Queen herself, or she called herself her Empress, her Exalted Highness, and all other types of, royal bullshit. She decided that she would make sure that she, even though now a prisoner, would have an air of royalty as she kept her head up and her head straight forward as she was cuffed and brought forward to all those in charge of humanity. When brought before the Council of Nations, she looked at the hall full of humans, all of them making her feel very, very small. This was quite literal, as she only stood about 1.3 meters tall, maybe slightly taller, but that might have been simply the way she had her hair done and the ornamental dress that she wore. In reality, she looked similar to what humans would know as a halfling or almost a goblin. Her slightly greenish skin did give that off, and she was small like one, but she was not skinny like you would expect one to be. Instead, her body was stout and filled out in many locations, similar to that of a gnome, but that was just one of the many, many names that they seemed to spit out as they tried to figure out what exactly to call them. Eventually, they would settle on 03, just like those of 02. The translator, once given to her and calibrated to her language, would simply change 03 to her own species name. It was simply that the humans could not name it, although any slang terms that were coming across would translate directly, or as best they could. The translator, of course, was still limited by its software after all. As she was marched to the podium, she was given several things to step on. It seemed as though a small set of stairs was already placed so that she could stand up much taller, so that she could be seen by all as they inquired all the things they wanted. She looked around, off to the corner. She could see the forearms and the smirk of species 02, and she was grinning. From ear to ear, she grinned. That strange, salamanderish, lizardish, almost humanish smile is something she had picked up from the humans as they saw that they smiled as well. These humans, as they like to call themselves, simply looked at her and in many cases were stifling laughter. She did not understand this at first, but pretty soon she realized that every time they said strange words, they would simply chuckle slightly, trying to keep their professionalism, but it was difficult. In more than one cases, while being brought to the chambers, somebody would say something, the others would laugh, and another human would swing over with one of those strong arms and swat them rather hard, enough to let them know that that was not acceptable. She was royalty after all, and she knew they would keep decorum with her. They would never try and force anything onto her. They would never force her to do anything, as she was empress, even though she had been suckered into this trap by her four-arm compatriot. She was not going to give up so easily. She looked across at each of them as the humans walked into the room, each of them sitting behind a different symbol. One symbol was white with a red dot in it. One was striped red and white. Another one was striped again with red, white, and blue. Another one was striped the same way, but in a different order. Another one used the same colors, but had a strange blue patch in the corner. It was odd. Each of these 7 members sat there and looking over. These seemed to be the most influential, but then she looked around and realized that everyone in the room had 1 or 2 sitting behind a different symbol and different characters next to the symbol itself. It was as though they were trying to differentiate themselves. She didn't understand this. How could they be so different? She looked closer and realized that they all dressed differently as well. It was odd. This was different from anything anyone had ever seen across the known universe. Everyone knows that you are all part of one government, one faith, one way of doing things, and you all followed one leader, the end-all be-all of your one species. But yet these humans were all there to hear from her. Yet she realized very quickly that the 7 that were in front of her were the ones that were going to be inquiring things. At least, mostly. Very soon a human spoke into a microphone, words she did not understand. She listened intently and then simply turned and grabbed the translator into her ear and looked at them and then made a strange gesture, shaking her hands. They all looked and were confused. The one in front of her said something again into his microphone. She again shook her hands, which was a gesture the same as a shrug in her idea. They went up and checked the translator, and then they gave it back to her. "We apologize about that, ma'am. Apparently it was not activated. Can you understand what we're saying?" She simply looked and was surprised that her own language was coming through, even though the human didn't speak it. She simply stated, "Yes, I can hear you. What do you wish of me? Why am I here?" "Well, simply put, you're here because you came after us. And we're deciding whether or not we should make an example of you, that's all. You do not dictate to me, she staggered. I am the Empress of 03. You will deem me with respect, and you will eventually all bow to me. She looked around, and they all seemed to have strange looks on their faces. Several of them lowered their heads and put their digits on their head and seemed to rub it back and forth. It's as though what she had said had been heard before so many times that they were simply tired of hearing of it. The one in charge simply replied to her, might I remind you that you lost? Your ship is now adrift in space, and right now our tugs are just trying to make sure it doesn't crash land on this planet. By the way, if it does, this entire city will be vaporized. So if I was you, I'd keep your tongue to yourself for a little while and listen. The Empress, though angry, heeded his warning. Now, I would like to know if this is true. You simply have to answer yes or no for these. Is it true that after the defeat of Species 02, you believe that they were a weaker species because they could not beat us? Yes. Is it true that you took advantage of their loss of military forces to, well, for lack of a better term, conquer them? Yes, we conquered them, as is our right. We did not ask for extras. It's simply yes or no questions. Did you come to Earth to, well, annihilate us? No. We came to subjugate you. With that, everyone simply looked at each other, and the eyes seemed to open a bit, and then close, narrowing as though they seemed to be concentrating more and more on a subject. So you came to enslave our people, ones that had already kicked the butt of your biggest rival in your area. Several sectors in every direction, from what we're understanding now as we're starting to rip apart your computers and get your history. You have no right to touch my ship. It's not your ship anymore, another voice cried out. Your ship was lost. You lost the fight, which means it is salvage and it belongs to us. That ship belongs to my species and it belongs to the hierarchy, as it belongs to me. They again reiterated, you don't have a ship anymore. If we want to, we will strip it for parts to build our fleet. Or we'll just reuse it and we'll use it as one of our own dreadnoughts. But this time we'll use weapons that actually work. With that, the Queen seemed to be a little bit put back. What do you mean, weapons that work? We are the strongest for 12 sectors in any direction. Our weapons are strong enough to fight back several different species at the same time. How dare you say they not work? Well, they couldn't kill us, could they? Well, Without any hesitation, the one in charge simply spoke up and said, we need to calm down. Ma'am, do you understand the right of conquest? Yes, I do. Then you understand that if you lose the battle, all materials are lost to you. But that ship belongs to me. It is a symbol of my power. Ma'am, you no longer have any power. How dare you say that? How dare you say that to me? Yet we will continue to say that. Because guess what? You lost. You got your ass kicked by a bunch of evil, hairless monkeys. That's what happened. Your own ship got penetrated so bad that several of our own rounds were going to probably be digging out of the engine compartment for 6 months. It was so easy to take down your ship, it's almost funny that you weren't ready for kinetic weapons. And all you did was have energy weapons. Even your point defense systems were energy weapons. Do you have any idea how easy it is to basically disperse any energy weapon that's fired at you? I am not an engineer, but we have the best ever. Apparently not, because we end up trashing your ship. Not only that, but our engineers are having absolutely no problem figuring out how your ship works. We have a report right here. And they actually used the word rudimentary several times. With that, the queen was confused. How could this new species believe that her ship, one that was developed and built only 2 decades prior, could be rudimentary? This was the pride of their fleet. It was an unbeatable ship as far as they were concerned, not only for the amount of weapons on it, but for the fact that it was so large that it would be almost impossible to take down. The bridge sat almost exactly in the core, which is, as she thought about it, probably the only reason why the bridge was not punctured by the rounds. She suddenly began to tremble slightly as she realized that one of these kinetic rounds had actually hit so deep that it only stopped at the very edge of her throne room. Had it been any more powerful, it would have actually gone all the way through and most likely had forced every single part of her bridge to be spaced. A fate that is so horrible, no one wants to think about it. They continued on. With everything we have discovered about your species, you believe in strength over all. Is that correct? Yes, strength is everything. Well, it's not enough. Of course it is enough. Wasn't enough to kick our asses. It wasn't enough to beat us. It was barely enough to force our fleet to back up a little bit to stay out of your own weapons envelope. And it wasn't enough to make sure our new allies over there didn't trick you into going ahead, going full throttle towards us at maximum burn so that they fell behind so that they cut you off and stopped you from retreating. She turned and again looked at our four-armed foe, and now that smile was so wide that the halfling herself started to wonder how that smile did not hurt the four-armed's face. They continued on with, now, with everything that is going on, we understand that it took several months to actually cross the void to get here. We also understand it's going to be several months before they expect you back. Though quantum entanglement would allow for immediate transmissions to your planet, it doesn't seem that you use that. I do not understand. It's not translating this quantum entanglement. Let's just say it's what we use. And what it does is extremely good. Along with that, we use a lot of our own basic technologies. Moving them together, you get maximum effect. And our maximum effect is what tore your fleet to pieces. We are in the process right now of still retrieving some of your people. Many of them are very, very injured. You're lucky, though. How are we possibly lucky? By being taken down by brutes and monsters like yourselves. You're lucky that we're not the monsters you think we are. Because our own medics are going in there, and if they have to, they're risking their own lives to save your people. And with that, the one in charge actually gave her a knife hand, and you could actually see him physically shake at the fact that she was degrading her people enough to think that they would actually fire at their rescuers. You do not get it, ma'am. We are not the most evil things here. Another voice chimed in, seemingly trying to stop the one in charge from actually losing his cool. If I may, sir. Ma'am, you do understand that if we were to actually wish you dead, you wouldn't be standing here, yes? She thought for a moment. Yes, that is obviously true, but you would not kill royalty. It is not done. It is never done. You never stop and kill any of the royalty, as they are gentlemen and ladies, and they must be able to commend the forces and let them know what to do. They are beyond reproach and should never be fired upon on the battlefield, even if they are present. Everyone knows this. With that, around the entire area, the room started to erupt in laughter. Some of them belly laughing. They're laughing so damn hard. The Empress of 03 simply looked around and was confused at this. She couldn't understand. Finally, one of the ones at the board simply turned and said, "Ma'am, you don't get it. You're priority number one to shoot on the battlefield. You don't get it. We don't care what your rank is. If you're a priority target, you're a priority target and you are dropped. If you are one of these folks who decides that nobody does anything without your say-so, that makes you not only priority number one, but that makes you the only target. That makes you the one that people will go through hell or high water. They will completely almost rip themselves to pieces just to get their hands on your throat. So I recommend you understand that we humans do not go by the same rules that you do. We never have. Not in over 300 years of our own histories have we protected the officers or the royalty on the field of battle. If anything, we aim for them first, because as we all know in here, as he raised his arms to emulate, if you take out the leader, you take out the snake, you chop the snake's head off, the snake will die. Is it not the same with you? She snapped back. Absolutely not. If I was up there, I guarantee somebody takes me out, takes me down, I'm out of the battlefield. The next in line's going to be able to jump up and do just as good a job because I trained him to do so. She was confused. She didn't understand this way of thinking. How could you possibly say that only royal blood can lead? Only royal blood can command? Only royal blood should be able to speak, and I am assuming that all of you are royal blood, and that you are the only ones with the right to speak to me as so completely degrading as you are? They all looked at each other. Ma'am, no one here is royal, as you would think it, using his fingers to almost quote. She didn't understand the gesture, but did believe it was an insult. Ma'am, royalty doesn't exist on this planet anymore, not since the first invasion. The royal families were actually hunted down during the first invasion. They were aimed at specifically. There's almost no castles left on this world either. You think they weren't targeted? I mean, that was actually, if you look over at 02 over there, she actually told everybody that if it looks like a castle, to blow it up with their main ships. They tried. Their weapons weren't strong enough to really beat their way in. They shot up a bunch of prisons, which was interesting. But that's the best they had. The problem is they didn't come for full-scale invasion. You did. And guess what? When your folks came in, they tried the same BS. They shot apart a whole bunch of castles, historical sites that will never be rebuilt the way they were. These structures are hundreds of years old, and you destroyed them. With that, another one put his hand on this one's arm as a way to try and calm him down. It was at that point that the Empress began to understand. So you believe in history? Of course we do. Without knowing your history, without knowing everyone's history, you are doomed to repeat said history over and over and over again, reliving the sins of the past. Do you not have something similar in your own doctrine? Our doctrine, our rules, are to obey the sovereign, the emperor or empress, and you will do so without question. We know our castes, we know our place. They are set when we are born, and they will stay with us forever unless something happens, forcing us out. But that is almost never the case. I have been empress for over 5,000 years. This made everyone gasp. And I will continue to be empress no matter what happens to me. They all looked at each other. 5,000 years. Oh, hold on. They all looked at each other and began shuffling behind papers, many of them turning their microphones off. They began to swipe through all their data pads and everything, trying to figure out what was going on. Turns out, their version of 5,000 years was only about 102 in human years. They all began to chuckle when they realized that. Ma'am, by our standards, you're only 102 years old. And thanks to the new technologies that have come out since the first invasion, we don't age either. What do you mean age either? I will never change from this form. So you're always going to be short and sweet? Which made everyone laugh. Short and... what? I'm short and tasty? Are you planning on eating me? With that, another ball of laughter came out. At that point, the one in charge and the one that actually said that lowered his head like, oh crap, I can't believe I just said that. I can't believe she just added on to it. As they continued the inquiry, they began to get a notice. This notice ran on every single one of the data pads, and they all turned, stopped the questioning, and looked at it. The Empress, still holding herself up straight with that lavish garb she was wearing, began to turn and look at everyone. It seemed like they were all getting the same notice over and over and over again. They all read very closely to see what was going on. Eventually, they turned back to her and very solemn. Ma'am, if what we're reading is true, and I need you to confirm this, when you conquered the sectors that 02 holds, you enslaved the population. Yes or no? Yes, as is the right of conquest, as we've stated before. And you've enslaved them in concentration camps. This did not translate. And she started tapping the translator. This did not say what it was. You've brought them into forced labor groups. And according to this, you are only giving them half rations? That is all they deserve. They have lost, and only the strongest of them will survive. Why would you only give them half ration? What does that serve? That serves to show the strongest ones, only the strongest ones that survive will be able to reproduce, and they will serve us as strong slaves from here on out. That is our way, and that is the way it will be, and they will be slaves forever. She turned and glared at 02, but hearing this, 02's Empress was not smiling. She had rage in her eyes. She was not happy. She simply turned to each of those in the council slowly, and then stood up and waved two of her hands, her species' way of asking to speak. Yes, ma'am. I believe she has something to say, gentlemen, if we will let her talk. Ladies and gentlemen, due to these enlightening reports, I ask one thing, and one thing only, and you will have an ally forever. I ask that you free my people. I beg of you. She then dropped down to all 6 legs, spreading her arms out wide as she lowered her head down low. She was already on her knees from her back legs, her 2 bipedal legs. This, in her culture, was how they begged. How they begged for anything to happen. This was to show she was exposing her weakest areas, to show that she was sincere. The council turned. The head of the council stood up, holding the microphone up so that they could hear him and he would not have to yell. Ladies and gentlemen of humanity, I know you're all listening to this out there. I know you're probably reading the reports right now. He motioned for his hand a little bit, and all the reports were immediately spilled onto the net. I want you all to look at these, to know that these reports are legitimate. I want you to remember our past. I want you to remember that we We're going into a more prosperous future as we spread out to the stars so this sort of shit would not happen again. This reflects on the darkest parts of our histories, a part that we had prayed that we had put behind us, a part that things like AI has circumvented. But now it is out there, it is in front of us, and we have a decision to make. And from here on out, I am asking this council, with the backing of all those out there listening, to declare a state of war against Species 03 for the liberation of the home system of Species 02. I ask this of all of you. Though this council in and of itself is its own republic way of doing things, I know that what we are asking goes beyond the areas that we want to cover, that this council was designed to cover. This was designed to help us protect ourselves, not to be the aggressors. But now, I don't know about you, but I don't see a choice. As he says this, a man in a uniform stands up and walks towards him from the side. He walks forward. There's a simple star on his uniform. Not 2, 3, or 4, but 1. Next to that is a symbol of one of their ships. On that symbol was the name of the ship. Hello, this is Captain Jones. You all know me. I was just up in space facing our new foes here, 03. I can tell you this, with or without the declaration, I know my men and women on board. We're going anyway. And with that, the votes already began. Even without a call for votes, they all came in. Green lights came on across the board. There was no red lights anywhere. They immediately chimed in, dinging all the way across as though a cacophony. The Empress of 03 looked aloft. She realized what was going on as all the governments across all of humanity were agreeing for a unified cause. She realized that she had only faced a small portion in space. As she looked over, she saw that some of them, she looked to translate, but she could tell that those were not flags, those were planets. That was Mars, there's Venus, there's a moon, there's other moons. This one looks like Jupiter. What they were all saying that they're in. They're all saying that they're ready to fight. And now, for the first time, she was truly, truly afraid. She started to shake. She looked to each of them and almost prayed for the first time that someone would come to save her. She turned back to the council and said, "You cannot do this. You cannot do this against us." With that, the one in charge of the council looked down at her and said, "It's done," and slammed his gavel down on the ground. And with that, she could even hear the cheers from outside the hall as everyone got ready for the fight. She realized that if they had taken down her capital ship, her flagship, the key to her entire navy, there was no way that the rest of her navy would be able to fight even half of the human ships, let alone what was going to be coming from their planets. With that, she was escorted off and brought to a holding cell. She could see on the way there several people looking at her. Some people spit in her direction. Most of them screamed different things at her, but she had taken her translator out. She didn't want to hear it. She simply held her head up high and walked over to the detention area. Once inside the cell, she saw that her command crew was there as well. They asked her, "Empress, I assume we're going to be released soon?" She simply responded, "No." For the next year, humanity prepared. For the next year, humanity rebuilt the flagship. For the next year, humanity stripped it down to its base components and refit the entire thing. And within a year, that gargantuan vessel looked nothing like it had when it entered the Sol sector. Instead of a bulbous, almost round shape, now it was in its true form, covered in industrial chic and brimming with weapons. The main guns had been replaced by several layers of energy weapons and also projectile cannons. Turrets were just strung upon the outside from the dorsal, ventral, port, starboard side, with several pairs of guns, each of them primed and ready to fire. One ballistic, one energy on each one. This thing was no longer an enemy ship. It was rechristened to a single word: retribution. The retribution would be the one to lead the human fleet. Not only was this ship ripped down to its components and rebuilt, but also all the colonies, all the planets of humanity had come together. Even those who privately owned ships offered their support as they, free of charge, were bringing supplies back and forth and back and forth. All they asked was a little bit of food and maybe small items like extra water, extra air, anything they needed to just keep going. But humanity had a single purpose. With this, video was being brought into each of the detainment areas, and they were shown just how far the humans had gone. This destroyed their morale. This caused many of them to actually rise up and start throwing things at their empress. Though some stayed true, some decided to protect her. Some decided that the Empress needed to be the Empress. They realized this was a losing battle. And she had done something to anger the humans, anger an entire divided species to come together. And it was going to be bad. The humans worked feverishly. Reports came down that many worked themselves into a coma and were immediately put in regeneration pods, trying desperately to make sure they stay alive. Though humans had the technology that they didn't age and they could keep themselves going, the body still has limits. Eventually, it got to the point where every single government, every single group decided to put in limits on how much time people could work. No more than 48 hours, and they must take a 24-hour break after that. When you're in space, you lose track of time. It's very easy to work for dozens of hours at a time and not even realize that time has even passed. But your body does know, as it will eventually wear out. This didn't matter to the humans, though. They worked until their eyes bled. They worked until their hands bled. They worked because their souls screamed. And with the retribution ready to take flight, almost the entirety of the Earth fleet was ready to go. They got ready with new engines, and Species 03 watched in horror as the human ships did not jump to FTL like all other species do. No, they seemed to go through what seemed to be a portal. 03's Empress watched on in horror as she saw the portal open up on the view screen in front of the entire fleet. She noticed that as the opening expanded well beyond, the stars in front of the ship changed. She thought this was a simple trick. However, as the ship went through the portal, there was a sudden jerk as she was yanked forward almost out of her seat. If not for the fact that she had been fastened to the seat by safety restraints, she would have gone flying across the bridge itself. The new redesigned bridge had the captain above her, watching over the entire crew. Each of the crew stations were reconfigured to be set up for humans, and they were extremely efficient. They began to move their hands across with a grace that she did not see in even her own subordinates. It was amazing how well they worked together. Some of them simply had to look at the other, give a strange expression, and they seemed to know what was needed to do next. They gave commands and orders to everybody. It seemed as though they all worked together as one, as a hive mind. She wonders if this was the true power of humans. She looked over to the Empress of 02, unrestrained but also in another seat, as she was solely trying to pick herself up off the floor from the sudden jerk of jumping from one system to the other. The captain simply called out, "Status!" And each of the stations yelled up to him with each of their status. They were all green across the board, as they said. The hell does that color have to do with anything? The Empress of 03 looked on as the view screen zoomed in to see many of her own ships now near 02's home planet. They had just jumped, somehow, several sectors in one moment, from one section of the universe to another, and this defied everything she understood. "How do you do this?" She screamed at them. Everyone seemed to not even give her a second glance. The captain, however, simply looked down and go, "It's fourth dimensions. You don't do fourth dimensions?" The Queen/Empress simply looked up confused, as she didn't even understand what he was talking about. He simply stated another thing. "It's quantum entanglement. You'll figure it out one day." With that, the entire fleet checked in, and she looked on the other view screens from everyone else and saw that every single one of the human ships had followed through this strange portal that seemed to end up right where they wanted to be. The human ships were already primed and ready to fight. As she looked at her own ships, the human captain went down to her, released her from her restraints, and stood her next to him on an elevated platform that seemed to be set up just for her. This time he would be right next to her, as she stood there, confused. "Open communications," he said. And with that, the video started. He could see a little bit of himself in the corner. He checked with his eyes just a little bit and then looked directly into the viewer. "This is Admiral Kleiner of the Earth Fleet. You will stand down, you will leave this planet, and you will release all your slaves. If you do not do this, we will be forced to fire on you." Within a few moments, another face seemed to jump in. "I am Supreme Fleet Admiral Shakna." This did not translate over to human, as everyone would have hoped. He continued, "And you have no right to do this. Our queen is already on the way to your planet, and she will end you." "Highness?" He looked confused and just realized suddenly that she was standing next to him. She was up on the platform, yet you could not tell that that's where she was standing. So it seemed as though the human only stood about 50% taller than her, but it was clear that there was a difference in the width of the human compared to her. In the back of the video feed, he could see the Empress of 02. Both should not be there. The only one he should ever see is the Empress. The commander spoke again. "You are to stand down, now." He looked over at the Empress of 03. "Your turn. Tell him to stand down." Hesitantly, she simply stated, "Yes, stand down. You will cease immediately. You will release your prisoners, and you do not give orders anymore. You have failed. You did not subjugate these humans, and you will no longer be our leader. We have a new empress now anyway." The Empress of 03 looked surprised, shocked, dismayed, was seemingly saying with her eyes, "What?" With that, another picture came in, And this one was of another female, again dressed in the same type of garb she was wearing when she first invaded Earth. "You have been removed, Mother." With that, the humans realized what was going on. This was a royal pain in the butt. Both were just trouble for us. With that, the commander butted in. "Well, if you're not going to listen to her, maybe you'll listen to this. We already took down your flagship. In fact, we're flying it right now. But we outfitted it with our own weapons and technology. As you can see, we can jump into wherever the hell we want. Either stand down or our next target's going to be your homeworld." With that, the Empress from 03 reached up with her hands still in handcuffs, grabbed a hold of his uniform, and pulled down with fear in her eyes as she did not want her planet to be bombarded. He didn't even do anything except rotate his shoulder a little bit to signify for her to let go. The other Empress, the new one, simply laughed and then cut the video feed. The commander said, "Well, we got our answer. Are we in weapons range?" "Yes, sir." "Is the rest of the fleet ready?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Tell them to fire at will. Take prisoners if possible, but I want the skies clear." And with that, the human ships began to rotate their turrets and began to fire with reckless abandonment. The other side was confused. They believed that there would be an honorable duel. They would be able to have time to adjust their ships, get them into position so they could face each other muzzle to muzzle, face to face. But no, the humans did not give them a chance. Since 03's group was concerned with honor, glory, and tradition, and the humans were concerned with, well, winning, it was a very one-sided battle. Many of the capital ships that were around the planet were immediately taken down. Many of them simply exploded as their engines took too much damage. Others were sent adrift. Some self-detonated, and yet most launched their life pods and sent themselves directly to the surface, hoping to make a final stand. But if they couldn't stop the humans in space, they had no idea what was waiting for them on the ground. The human fleet had no problem moving into position. Those from the species of 02 looked on gleefully, but wisely said nothing. They simply waited for the humans to actually take the planet so they could have their home back. They knew this was the deal, and they did not want to spoil anything. They knew they would be duty-bound, life locked in to each of the humans that helped them out. They would owe them a debt that they would never be able to pay back, provided that the humans were able to take the planet. And yet they were happy and worried. Could the humans take the planet without having to bombard it, without having to glass the entire surface down to molten rock? This is what the Empress of 03 expected. She expected to watch as the humans moved into position and simply laid into the planet with their weapons. But the humans had a different idea. The captain simply yelled out to his XO, "All right, once we're in position, everyone deploy. Don't wait for us to get there. As soon as you're in position, deploy. And I want them to cry havoc." "And release the dogs of war," the entire crew repeated. This was confusing to both the 02 and 03 as they did not understand this. The Empress of 03 simply looked and said, "Release canines of battle?" Obviously, something didn't translate right. The captain turned to her slightly and then went back to viewing the screen, simply saying, "No, it's a phrase for total war, for a release of our people to go into battle with no preconceptions and no restrictions." She didn't understand. All she knew is that she watched as many of the ships altered their course so that their ventral side was facing down towards the planet. And then not only did many small pods, seemingly life pods, start streaming out of the ship at insane rates of speed. But also right behind them were multiple shuttles. Small atmospheric fighters went down in front of them, and then troop transports loaded to the gills with all sorts of men and materials. Not only that, but right behind them was another type of dropship. These had heavy weapons strapped to them. And at this point, she realized the humans were not playing a game. She asked again, was sent out across all the communications. She begged for her own people to stand down, or else they will end up being slaughtered by the humans. The humans were more dangerous than they even could imagine, and what she got in return was a bunch of insults and laughter. Strange, odd cackling came back over. And at that point, she realized that it was lost. And all she could do was hold her head down as she watched the video feed of those in the pods landing right after their chutes opened, getting on the ground, the doors flying open, and they went out with reckless abandonment. Many of those on the ground, if they had the four arms, they didn't know if the humans had come there to destroy, so they fought as well. They were subdued usually, but more often than not, they had to take a few hits before they went down. They were about the size of the humans, although the humans were much, much bulkier. Along with that, the humans kept their body armor, their full body suit covered in some sort of metallic composite. She couldn't tell what, but it shook off all sorts of projectiles and energy weapons like they weren't even there. Not only that, but strapped to the back and also to the arms were a myriad of weapons and technologies. Many of them used flame to spray across. The flames didn't go out no matter what you hit them with. It was strange, and it was horrible to watch these halfling gnome things just burn. The species 03 was wiped out. The few that were knocked unconscious, the few that had survived any injuries, were taken prisoner and given immediate medical attention. Brought back, and they found out very quickly that the humans dressed in green, brown, or black, and sometimes even a dark red, were something to be feared. Certain symbols were to be feared beyond all else, but those that were in white, with a strange red symbol, a bar straight up and down, crossed with a bar that is horizontal. That was the one they wanted. That was the one they did not fear. As many of them went up to the injured who were screaming in pain, would immediately stop the bleeding and hit them with some sort of drug that immediately took away the pain. Then they would realize that these same armored-clad humans would pick them up and carry them back to a ship where they would receive more medical attention. They did not understand why would the humans do this. They didn't understand. The Empress on the bridge watched as the ceremonial chambers were breached. Fire came out like crazy. All sorts of blasts, all sorts of energy and projectile weapons came out the doorway, but the humans seemed to sit on the side of the doorways almost nonchalantly, and waited. Then suddenly she looked, and on the video she could see a couple of them holding up these strange type of orbs. They were strange, surely. What would these metal orbs do? It was odd. Other ones pulled up these other cylinders, and they all seemed to shake them slightly. Then they all grabbed the side, seemingly pulled something off, and on one signal they all threw them in, bouncing them off the walls and into the chambers. And then a few seconds later, after they ducked to the side, there was a mass of explosions, bursts of noise, flashes of light, and huge concussive forces coming out. It was enough that she had to reach up and cover her ears because of what was coming through the microphone. By the time she opened her eyes after that, she realized that the humans were already inside, taking down any of the honor guard that was there. And before she knew it, the new Empress, her daughter, had come down with a heavy weapon and tried to shoot one of the humans, and had succeeded. As she looked on with seemingly pride in her face, well, it was only there for a moment. The humans shot her so full of lead you could have used her as a number 2 pencil. Her body slumped and fell down the stairs, tumbling down each one like a slinky. A few moments later, and the battle was over. The humans had won. Species 02 was contacted immediately by their Empress as soon as she was able to be sent out via the comms, and then she was brought down to the surface. Every human knew that this was going to be a way to quell the population, to let them know that humans have come this time as liberators and not conquerors. The species 03 had seen its first true defeat in almost a millennia, and by a new species nonetheless. And before they realized what was truly happening, they were all brought into camps, but this time they were not treated to the whip, to the cane, or forced to work. No. They were given medical attention, beds to sleep in, cover from the elements. They were surprised. How could a creature so dangerous, so deadly, that it was estimated that they had only lost maybe 20 or 30 of their own, an entire planetary invasion? How could they be so nice? The Empress of 03 had finally seen what we call the duality of man, that we could be so dangerous and yet so kind to them, and she begged for an alliance with the humans, to the point that she actually went up to the commander and in front of everyone stripped her clothes off and offered her body as collateral, offered the captain to marry her and become part of the royalty, and by that the humans would be seen as equals. This was a law that was put into effect generations ago and was never used. Though the crew was a little put back at the sight of this halfling suddenly stripping off her clothing, and of course grateful that she had a basically humanoid body, basically a little more stout and a little more filled out in certain areas, yet you would be hard-pressed to not think she was a human that suffered from a condition that had been completely eradicated a long time ago. But in that moment, the captain simply walked up to her as she stood there, and she lowered her head, submitting to him. He simply reached down, put his fingers under her jaw, lifted her head, and looked into her eyes. "Sorry, ma'am. I'm already married." At this point, she was more than a little embarrassed as she stood there bare-assed to the entire crew, who was enjoying the show, although still trying to stifle their laughter a little bit. But she would find out within a month's time that they had zero interest in holding her people. They didn't want to hold them hostage, nor that they didn't want slaves. Their home planet was well beyond the sectors of humanity, and humanity had no interest in them. At least it wouldn't be for generations to come, and she was informed as such. Fairly soon, her entire population was loaded onto human ships, and they made another jump to her home planet. She, thankfully clothed this time, sent a plea to her own people to not fire on the ships as they were carrying refugees. Their own people were confused, and of course attempted to say that she had fallen prey to any type of sway. She was no longer viable as an empress, but that was until they showed the video of the new empress being torn apart by projectile fire, and they realized that the humans were not someone you wanted to fuck with. And with that, many of the ships landed, opened their doors, and not a single human stepped out. But they simply ordered those inside to leave. And once they were ordered to get clear because the humans were taking off. The door shut and the ships simply left. Those that had survived the battle were able to go home, and as a good sign of faith, humans had allowed another species to live. This one would not have a long time to rebuild as 02 would. Zero Two would have to not only rebuild their planet, but rebuild their civilization and their population all at the same time, which would not be an easy task. But they would not be alone. And as they looked at their broken world and tried to figure out how they were going to rebuild, they simply looked to the humans. One of them said, "How can we possibly do this? Our infrastructure is gone. We have no power." And the human simply replied, looking at all his gear and the ship coming down, "No power? No problem." Helping with the rebuilding of the Four Arms home planet after the halflings had been told to, quite simply, go away, would take time. It would take time, it would take a lot of sweat, a lot of materials, possibly some blood, but it would definitely need personnel. Many, many human volunteers would head to this planet simply to aid in the reconstruction. This confused their four-armed compatriots as they realized how nasty humans had been before. Humans, these scrawny little bipeds, had been able to go and take them down, fight them so well, take down an entire invasion force and still keep going. And now they were coming to help make sure that their species was well maintained. This was surprising to all of them, but it was a welcome sight, especially since those that survived the invasion and liberation were not in very good shape. Many of them would spend several days inside medical tents just getting IV after IV and meal after meal, trying to get them back into some sort of shape. I know they say round is a shape, but they weren't round. They were basically straight lines, as there was nothing to them. Some of them were so far below body weight that they actually had to be put into coma, induced so that they would not move around as their body began to take in the nutrients given. But you had to be very careful with this. Just like dealing with anyone who has not eaten in a long time, if you simply fill their stomach, they will eat and eat and eat until it kills them. So they had to be very careful. And during this time, humanity got to work. Ships came down all over the planet with prefabricated buildings, landing as close to cities as they could, bringing down with them all sorts of heavy equipment as they began to move rubble, move old buildings, clear roads, rebuild bridges, set up their underground power supplies so that everything could work. Eventually, humans would bring in their zero-point generators, even though it's not really a generator, to hook up inside each of the house. This one device, the Four Arms, had worked on something, but never anything this small. But this one device changed them all, changed the way they lived, as they no longer had to link into their houses like some sort of strange hive. They seemed to only want to do this as a way of tradition anyway. As it turns out, each of the Four Arms began to take on characteristics similar to humans the more they worked with them. At first, most of the Four Arms wanted to stay together in groups, but eventually would begin to work on their own or simply in pairs, many times paired with a human, and they would end up getting close, usually as friends and drinking buddies and so forth. But through that whole thing, there was something that everyone knew was going to happen, but everyone thought it would take longer. Eventually, the fact that more four-armed females, approximately 5 to 1 compared to males, had survived the invasion and occupation and liberation of their home planet and home sector, this was going to lead to some very large problems. In particular, when you have a small group like this, inbreeding is going to be a very major problem. The females seemed to understand this very well. So did the males, so they didn't take it too personal when a few of the females started to get a little close with the humans. Although it was more of a running gag than anything else whenever one of the four-armed females would get close to a human, thinking they were so nice, so helpful, just for the human to finally raise their visor and show that the human inside was female as well. It was also another one when it was a male looking onto a male, and then the human called them something. It was a strange human word that they didn't understand. It didn't translate either. but apparently was a very strong insult, and then simply turned and went back to work. The forearm folks were always confused when this happened, but understood that it is the way it is, and mistakes happen. All in all, the reconstruction went by almost like clockwork. More and more humans showed up to aid the forearm folks in making sure their planet was put back together. Not only did they repair their buildings, their infrastructure, and all others, but they also began to help with the farmland. Many human farmers showed up with tons and tons of equipment, making sure they strictly used the native soil, the native seed, and all the native flora and fauna. They did not bring their own, ever. The only thing they brought of their own was fertilizer, and a lot of it. They had to refertilize the land, as the land had been worked too hard under the yoke of slavery. This was always a problem, and humans understood it very well. The forearm folks didn't understand this, even though they used to be slavers themselves. They used to simply beat a few more of their slaves until production improved. But it doesn't work that way. This is farming after all. There's always an X, Y, Z, and an N factor going on. Once they realized this, and they finally got crops to grow, things got so much better. Many humans wanted to stay on the forearm planet, and were welcome to, but only in certain amounts, as the forearms did not want their planet to become a simple human colony, and they were visitors on their own home planet. This was understandable, and a council was brought together. The human delegation brought up this concern and told them that they would limit the amount of humans that showed up. They would gladly do this to make sure there was no difficulties anymore, as they were now allies, compadres, friends with each other. The forearm delegation did not fully understand this at first until the translator finally caught up. At least the word allies was enough to help them. Not only this, but they had shown that they were more than willing to fight alongside the humans. And one of the human generals stood there, stolid and proud, and simply stated how that though the forearms were once our enemies, they have stood side by side with humans, and they have shed blood equally. And those who shed blood with me shall be my brother, he said. The forearms, fully understanding most of the English by this point, understood this, and there was many a wet eye in the house, especially that of the Empress. The Empress of the forearms simply stood there, although she trembled. She did also have a request. She wanted at least one or two humans to be on her version of a cabinet, her circle of advisors, it was difficult to pronounce. I can't even try now. It is their language after all. And of course, they have two separate tongues, so it does make things a little difficult. With that, the humans agreed, but they would be very selective on who they would send. The Queen/Empress there decided that she would have to interview to let them know who would be allowed, and eventually settled on a simple ensign, one who was looking to be promoted. This one had come in and fought side by side with one of her family members, and had actually freed not only a few more of the family members, but had personally carried her niece, one who was barely 3 or 4 planetary cycles out of her egg, and put it in the Empress's hands when the liberation happened. This was such a sign of respect for them that humanity almost couldn't wrap their head around it. Almost. And while this was happening, they realized that, well, maybe they're not so different after all. Eventually, making sure the planet was survivable, much of the human military began to pull away. However, this had its own issues. You see, the forearm females began to get a little too close to human males and started to actually try and produce. Unfortunately, it succeeded. And now human blood is intermixed permanently inside their society. It's easy to tell them apart, of course. They're usually a little shorter, much stockier, but a whole lot stronger. It was kind of a running joke that they would simply be caught in the forearm's web. Whenever you heard the old poem, "Welcome to my home," said the spider to the fly, was always said with a little bit of a grin. Always said slightly so that someone would realize, yep, he's fucking one of them. But with that, they realized that it would be a simple matter of the war brides from back in the day. Eventually, they would be moving to Earth, as they would realize that life is a bit better there. Or one of the colonies, that is. Over on the halflings' homeworld, things were messy, but survivable. They made sure that things were still working. And, of course, the humans did show up every once in a while just to show up and say, "Hi, how you doing?" Unfortunately, for the humans who showed up, many times they were accosted, not in a bad way. They were simply shown extreme hospitality that was well beyond the halflings' capacity, as their planet had been basically shut down. At least they were starting to come back to it. Eventually, they got used to being treated this way, but started to bring their own gifts. And by gifts, this would have to be large supplies of things like grains, foods, maybe some sort of generators or something along those lines. Anything to help them out. Humanity's not total monsters after all. We're just demons. And it was on one of these visits that the Empress of the Halflings once again came up to one of the humans and offered that one of them marry her so that they could be part of the royalty. Again, the humans refused, even though it was clear to see on a few of their eyes that they were thinking about it. But then again, there was an issue they didn't want to think about. The idea that maybe if they were to be, say, married to the Empress, they worried that they might actually hurt her incidentally. The halflings being so small, it was actually very common during the invasion for one of them to quite literally be punted a good 20 feet. This was funny when thought about the first time, at least during battle, but you wouldn't want to accidentally do that to one of the kids running around. So many of the humans simply stayed clear. And while they did, they continued to talk the wonderful world of politics that nobody seems to enjoy. But while this was going on, a few of the halflings tried to get human DNA to try and mix into their own. If they didn't try to get it through saliva or accidental cuts on someone's hands, they would try to get it from any type of epithelials from the skin. The halflings were not stupid. They were very, very smart. Just not smart enough to take on somebody who was twice their size with the same amount of technology. In their search for the DNA, eventually they fell down to the old standby of being able to mix in genetic codes. At least they believed it should be possible. Considering humans and halflings are very similar in appearance, and seemingly very similar on internal structure, being that one heart, two lungs, intestinal tract, liver, and all the other fun standbys that they all have, they figured, why the hell not? And at one of the parties, they got much of the human delegation, along with their guards, extremely intoxicated, which seemed to take a long, long time. The humans seemed to be able to take the bottles of what they call greg. The humans call it grog, because of its flavor apparently is not very good, for lack of a better term. It's not palatable really for humans, but they seem to simply grab the bottle, pull the cork out the top, flip it upside down, and be able to drink it down in just a few moments and simply ask for another. They seem to enjoy the sensation of the ethyl alcohol that's in it. They didn't seem to be bothered by it, as they put 12, 14, 24 of these bottles down within a matter of an hour. The halflings were amazed at this. Note to self, never get in a drinking contest with humans. Eventually, the grug kicked in. And when it did, the humans had difficulty. As long as they were sitting down, they were fine, but as soon as they got up, they immediately fell over. If they were standing up and decided to sit down, immediately they would fall over. It seemed to not affect them until this change in height happened. And this is what the halflings were waiting for, especially with the security detail. The security detail simply flopped down, and, well, the halflings went to work. Many of the security detail, when interviewed later, would say they barely remember anything. They do remember seeing some very interesting sights, but it was like they were beyond intoxicated. In fact, they were able to see what was going on, but they were also unable to move. They could feel everything. Their sense of touch wasn't gone. Their sense of taste was shot, which was, at least in one instance, they could say that might have been a good thing, considering where the halfling was. Well, where she was sitting, that is. And then they explained what had happened, and this put all the human delegations in an uproar. The halflings didn't understand what they had done wrong, as this was how their culture actually operated. The females simply grab a man and take them. That is what they are. They are a very matriarchal society. Men are there as drones. They're there to fight and to work and to be chosen as mates every once in a while. But that's pretty much all a man ever does. They don't hold any political power. This kind of still pissed off the humans. The fact that they called it a strange word that they didn't understand. They simply called it forcing. Well, the halflings still did not understand what they did wrong. But humanity was a little mad at this. At least for a little while, until the snickering and the jokes came into play. The humans, after all this, began to get a reputation for the most hedonistic race out of all of them. It was believed that many of the humans would simply make jokes, say one thing, how it was completely disturbing or disgusting, and then in the next moment turn around and do the actual act that they said was so disgusting. Well, it wasn't disgusting for very long, as eventually halfling space became a vacation place. Many of the folks that visited obviously were there for only one idea, one thing to do, and do it a lot, many times, as much as possible before they completely passed out, and then they'd wake up and do it again. Humans were noted for this. However, it wasn't long before the halflings were put a little back. They found that, unfortunately, they couldn't conceive through humans. They were a little put back by this. A little bit more than you would think. But this also made it possible for them to, shall we say, increase their availability for vacations. Humanity, not at war, was very into whatever pleasures they could get. They had to be, because they never knew what was going to come next. Even though humanity was basically immortal now, thanks to zero-point quantum energies, it still didn't mean they didn't enjoy the pleasures. No. In fact, tourism became the new ideal. Humans would come in with all sorts of supplies, all sorts of items for the forearms or the halflings, and it became a strange triad, as the forearms and the halflings would show them all sorts of exotic materials, all different types of exotic plants. Many of them were at different beaches, climbed different mountains. Sometimes it was something that even the local population couldn't do, but the humans insisted on doing it. Not only would they climb these mountains, but they would get a running start and jump off using just a simple piece of nylon to make sure they didn't splat on the ground. Many of the forearms and the halflings did not understand this. Why in the hell would humanity do that? And humanity simply had one answer for them. Chemicals. They were confused. Could you explain that? Well, dopamine is the pleasure chemical. When they go and spend some quality time with you, dopamine is released in very large quantities. Not only that, but also doing something like enjoying a meal or accomplishing some sort of task like climbing the mountains or whatever, that's dopamine. However, a bigger thrill is adrenaline, something that scares the living crap out of you. One of the forearms actually asked, why would they want to put excrement in their own pants? That doesn't make sense. No, that's a slang. I'm sorry. Let me explain. The higher the thrill, the more adrenaline is released. Adrenaline just feels really good. Now, if you watch this video here, you can see where small doses of dopamine and adrenaline are released, all for something as a simple workout. They showed a video of somebody lifting heavy weights, and when they were done, ah, ah, the man yelled as he flexed his muscles. Both the forearm ambassador and the halfling ambassador seemed to kind of move around slightly in their seat as they saw the massive muscles of this human being flexed. Suddenly, the human ambassador very quickly turned it off, realizing what was happening. And that is what happens. We humans, we enjoy this, but we have to be careful. If we overindulge, we don't feel it anymore. But going to your planets, even though we're working most of the time, spending our money, spending our resources to go to your areas and have some fun, they get a huge dopamine and adrenaline release. They were still confused, but seemingly agreed, but surprisingly, things like this brought the halflings and the forearms closer together. They were no longer enemies. In fact, it was very common to see them operating in trade. And with this, the triad was complete. The final connection was made. And all three were at peace. They all had huge sections of space. The humans had stretched out for 4 sectors, beyond their own, of course. And then the halflings still had their half a dozen. Forearms had to retake theirs, which was 4 in total. But this still allowed for a lot of growth in any direction. This allowed for all the different governments, all the different religions, all the different ones to fall into place. And it was a glorious time. And it was time for everyone to enjoy the peace. Because peace doesn't last. It was on the far side of the human sector when they found a large group of synthetic vessels coming in. These synthetic vessels were immediately caught on any sensor that was pointed in that direction. And immediately other sensors were pointed that way to see what was coming in. They looked to see what could be coming. To their surprise, it was another group of ships. These were not part of the triad. They had their own distinct look. They looked, well, sleek, for lack of a better term. They were almost aerodynamic. In the way they moved through space, they seemed to glide. Humanity initially shuddered. Then they sent out a word, a communication. Hello. Welcome to human space. Can I help you? They didn't receive a response for several human days. Humanity simply waited. They knew that these folks received the signal, but it's possible that their translators just were not able to figure it out yet. So they continued to wait as these ships moved into a distant human sector, one that barely had any colonies on it. Humanity waited. They realized that a group this large could be a colonization group, but this could also be a warband. They didn't know. So they readied the fleet. They didn't know anything until they saw another group break off and head straight into halfling territory. They didn't realize at first, but when you looked at the map, you realized that all they had to do was turn slightly and they would actually reach a halfling planet before they even reached a human-owned planet. They watched closely. They sent a few more messages. Please tell us your reason for being here. Please respond. Hello, this is humanity. Please respond. They had got zero response. They knew for a fact that these transmissions were getting there as they sent them on probes, and the probes were actually captured by these ships and brought on board. They had sent a strange type of craft with several long appendages to grab a hold of the probe and bring it inside one of their ships. So they knew that this species was getting the message. So they watched. Word was passed around to the Triad. Who was this? Who were they? No one knew. The halflings had never come across this species, and the forearms definitely wouldn't know because it was on the opposite side of human space compared to them. Plus, they hadn't reached out that far either. But they all watched as the halfling colony came into view of the ships. The ships slowly came towards the planet and then seemed to stop just inside lunar orbit and just stayed there. Many messages were sent up from the surface and were also sent from space, asking them to respond. Eventually, one ship was sent, a human ship, a very small corvette, only armed with point defense systems, so not as to spook anyone. And they would send over and find out what the hell was going on. Along with that, the halflings had sent a small flotilla of their own, 4 ships in total. 1 destroyer, and 3, if you want to call them corvettes, because they might as well just be cargo haulers at this point, had been sent over as a delegation. They also wanted to be there in case they had to evacuate their own people. And this was probably the smartest thing they did. Because as the ships came up, sending all sorts of messages claiming that they were from either the halfling race or from humanity, asking the other ships to respond, without hesitation, those ships launched several other small ships from their belly and dropped towards the planet. This was no colonization. You attack with that many, this is a frickin' invasion. With that, the humanity's corvette tried to turn and burn to get out of there, but it was almost too late. Everyone watched as the ship itself was fired upon by several different types of energy weapons. There was also some sort of projectile that whipped past. The pilot was good, was very good, but no one is that good. Eventually, the ship was hit hard enough that the engines went offline and it went adrift. With that, the halfling battle group went to the other side of the planet, trying to keep away from this new assaulting force, and shot their cargo ships towards the surface as fast as they possibly could. Although not nearly as fast as a human ship, they did make good time to the surface. They screamed a warning for everyone to get ready for evacuation, and the human ship that was disabled could only sit there and watch as all the cargo ships were fired upon. It didn't matter if they were on their way to the surface, loading up with civilians, or just trying to get the hell away. Their destroyer tried everything it could to fight them back, but it was just too outgunned. With this, humanity knew what to do. Humanity flipped the switch. They were at peace before, and they enjoyed it. But you know what else humanity loves? They love war. And the call went out to all 3 in the Triad. Ready the fleets. The lone human ship continued to broadcast what it had seen as long as it possibly could. They would have made their way out of there if they possibly had the chance, but that glancing blow they took not only damaged certain components, but it completely perforated and annihilated key components necessary for their engines to operate. They were on emergency power, and their time was limited, and they knew it. But still, they used some of their power just to send the message. The video of what happened the halfling ships desperately trying to land, trying extremely hard to load up as fast as they could and try to get away, and it didn't matter what happened, they were all taken down, some of them loaded with nothing but women and children, as they plummeted towards the planet in a fireball. The destroyer, though, put up a decent fight, fired with everything it could, but seemingly its weapons were either absorbed or refracted on the surface. They couldn't barely make a dent. And even though they tried, God help them, they tried. They could not save any of the cargo ships, and they couldn't even save themselves. As the last cargo ship was down, they could see the destroyer was desperate to get away from the planet, trying any way, shape, or form to get out of the line of fire, as it tried in vain to exit the gravity well and get far enough away where they could jump. But they just couldn't. As they tried to spin up their engines, they were shot from all different angles. It seems whatever these were knew that if they let this ship get away, there was a chance it would bring back their allies. What they didn't think of looking for was the fact that the ship they thought they had destroyed was only disabled. The videos continued. They tried to look as fast as they could as several large cities and large structures were destroyed. Some hydroelectric dams were just blown to pieces, causing areas to flood. But then it got worse. Distress calls were sent out, videos that were picked up of several of those on the ground trying desperately to stop what was going on, trying desperately to keep the new enemy at bay. They tried like hell to survive. But because they tried, and because they had the video, there was only a few quick frames worth of it, but you could finally see what they were facing. These things did not look biologic. They did not seem to be biological at all. In fact, they were almost completely synthetic. At least that's what they could see. The exterior of these things that walked on 4 legs came through with also 4 arms, but not the same as the 4-arm friends that we have. This seemed to put a small rift, but only for a moment, in the triad as they reviewed the video, as they compared the differences between what they could see between our foes and our allies. The foes walked on 4 legs. Our 4-arm friends did not. They were bipedal. Though both had 4 arms, it was clear that those who were synthetic had much more clear definition in their arms. Our 4-arm compatriots, though taller than humans, definitely taller, about 70% taller, were quite gangly, as humans would call them, thin, and didn't seem to have as much power as they would need. In fact, their bodies were more set up, when you break it down, to be more insectoid in nature, the way their musculature was set up, which is what kept them, though skinny, surprisingly strong. The synthetic ones, however, it was clear their musculature was more set up akin to human, different segmented muscles attached to the bone. Well, if they had bones, that is. But the main difference was in the body. Our 4-arm compatriots had a much more humanoid shape. The synthetic ones, it was simply a round, almost like a trash can, look to them. It was though this was a central processing unit, not given any show to aesthetics at all. It was not trying to be pleasing to the eye. In fact, it looked like a 4-legged, 4-armed turd going around. And the biggest difference between the two is that our 4-arm compatriots had a head. These new things did not. It seems like the sensors were in the center of it, in the torso. There was no eyes that they could see, no ears or anything of that nature. Just a body with arms and legs as it moved forward. 2 of the arms were fashioned with weapons. Most of these seemed to be energy weapons. Every once in a while you would see one with some sort of flamethrower, though seemingly not very effective, as the distance was only about a meter. Humans seem to laugh at this, as flamethrowers that are used for recreation for humans throws flame far, far further than this. And as they reviewed the video, they could see that the flame was more of a fear tactic than anything else. It was used to flame into a room before they entered. It seemed as though they had some sort of tactics with them. They would use it to make everyone inside back up, as there is a primal fear of fire, a fear of being burned, but that did not stop anyone from holding position and firing like mad whenever these things came in. But halflings, being so small and not being able to hold high caliber weapons, were not able to make much of a dent. Every once in a while you would hear something of the radio screaming about "they got one," usually followed by screeches of pain as they were ripped to pieces. The few video frames they had of one showed this, and everyone looked at the forearms and apologized for any phrases that might come out when they thought that maybe that the local population would assume that these were some sort of relatives of them, maybe some sort of offshoot, but it was clear that they were not. The forearms had a sadness in their eyes at the thought that they would be looked at as an enemy to their new friends. Humanity didn't care. Humanity only knew one thing: their new allies, their friends, but more importantly, when they broke it down, part of their family had been assaulted. Since humanity had reached out to the stars, the amount of children being born was fairly low. The only time it had spiked any was when they started to, shall we say, experiment with their new friends. Even though the biology didn't exactly sync up, there was new birth rates. This did surprise a few, but even though you're looking at a 0.001% chance of conception on a good day, it was still possible. And because of that, this is where the halflings and the forearms did not understand the humans' rage and the fact that they took this personal. Though they might have lost everyone on that ship that was monitoring because they could not get to them in time before their power just ran out, they looked over at their new allies with compassion. And then they looked over at the screen at their new enemies with sheer rage and hatred. A rage and hatred they had not seen in humanity since the first time they had met. And now they would see what humans do when they're truly let free. Plans were made, everyone was drawn up, and fleets were readied. But first they had to retrieve their vessel. Their vessel they tried to reach, but it wasn't there. They couldn't figure out what was going on, and eventually they looked at one of the green moons that was within the sector. They checked, and sure enough, they received the slightest of response of a ping from a transponder, and humanity went down to that green moon, a jungle planet, which most everyone considered was going to be far too dangerous for them to colonize. The humans who landed looking for their compatriots were amazed by the fact that when they came up to them, everyone was sitting around a fire cooking up some sort of local fauna. And simply cut a piece off and said, "You guys hungry?" Everyone forgot that when it comes to humanity, it didn't matter if they had power or not. They always made the best of whatever the situation was. And the fact that most all of humanity was more than a little trained in survival tactics. In fact, it was becoming a pastime for most humanity to go to areas that would be, shall we say, hazardous to your health, and figure out how to survive without all the amenities that came with a heightened technology. And with this, humanity took a sigh of relief. Even though they did lose a few people, they did salvage some of their own. And the two others of the triad believed that this would quell the humans' rage a little. That is, until they sent their own fleets to the human fleet to join up. The forearms, still reeling from their own invasion and recovering of their own planet, only had a half a dozen ships at their disposal, but they did send what they could. The halflings, however, still had a pretty large force of approximately 50 combat vessels. These ranged anything from corvettes to destroyers. They didn't have anything bigger. But when they pulled into the rally point, they saw something amazing. They saw that humanity was not pulling any punches. Humanity was going to send everything. Humanity's war fleet was there. Their flagship led the way. The refit ship that they had captured was there, but now it wasn't alone. Another ship, almost as large as itself, was there, but it was a completely human design from bow to stern, and it was clearly designed specifically for one thing: to kick Xeno ass. And with that, they received their orders from humanity. "We will take point," they told their friends. "We have the biggest guns, we have the biggest ships. We need you all in the second and third lines. We will give you the coordinates of when to jump in the FTL space, or you can wait until our third and fourth line is going to rip a hole in time space and you can follow us through. Be warned, you have to be within a certain area or the vortex is going to cut your ship in half. We will give your helmsmen all the details they need, but if you wish to jump in FTL space instead of following us, then by all means. But you're going to have to time this just right." They all looked confused at this, but the humans continued explaining how they were going to jump in and just start wailing on the enemy. They were not going to sue for peace. They were not going to ask for a response. If they received any sort of call from them, they might answer. But humanity had seen these things rip halflings apart, and halflings were not that strong to begin with. Though strong for their own kind and strong for their size, they weren't nearly that powerful. They were simply powerful from their numbers and the fact that they were great ship commanders. Normally, without using any type of pride to get in their way, they are extremely dangerous. But now, humanity would be their sword, would be their shield, because again, they were now family. The other two members, the halflings and the forearms, did not fully understand this, as they looked at humanity as still a separate species, but most humans simply smiled at this and then went back to work. Within just a few planetary rotations, everyone was ready to go. They knew that the ship itself would be able to jump in close and be able to rain all sorts of holy hellfire, but they wanted the planet. It doesn't make sense to destroy a planet to win a battle when you want the technology that's there. Humanity's primary goal was, of course, to secure everything. The secondary goal was to get the technology that was there as to integrate it into their own. And they would want this, and it turns out they would need this. As the fleet folded space and opened up their portal to jump through using the quantum singularity to go into the new space, the other races were simply amazed at this as they sat idling by next to the ships that they were going to follow in the next few hours. What they did not see after the portal itself closed was that the human ship simply went across the equator, went to the east and west, and looped around the planet. If an enemy ship was within range, they did not give any sort of warning. They simply raised their turrets, adjusted, and fired. To their absolute amazement, the energy weapons did not penetrate the enemy hull. They either reflected, or were absorbed in them. Seemingly, this made the ship move faster. The enemy ship would move faster, and faster, getting closer the more it was hit. It seemed as though they had found a way to absorb energy weapons into their hull with some sort of plating that humanity had not figured out yet. This made humanity want it even more, but they still wanted blood a whole lot more. And as the ships got closer, a few broke off so they could land on the planet, sending a whole bunch of pods down, all of them armed to the teeth and ready to start beating some of these headless bastards into the ground. In space, the large ships got in formation, and instead of continuing to fire to give the enemy more energy, they said, okay, can't use power? Not a problem. They adjusted to a separate set of turrets and began to use kinetic weaponry, and this proved to be unbelievably effective. They did not use the point defense cannons with these tiny little bitty slugs, as that wouldn't be any useful to anything in space, really, unless you were point blank. You would need to focus fire on these to be able to punch through the ship to do any sort of damage. No. They used the rods from hell. These rods were approximately 1 meter in diameter and 25 meters long. They would launch them through coil guns at a speed that almost dwarfed that of energy weapons, and they would pierce the enemy ships stem to stern, completely skewering them. It didn't take more than a handful of shots to realize exactly where the engine compartment was. They couldn't figure out where the bridge was to try and take that out to spare the engines, but it didn't matter. The gunners and the crews began to fire wholeheartedly at them, and they saw that a few of the smaller ships began to turn and try and make distance as they were trying to escape the gravity well enough to jump to their own FTL speed. But humanity realized that this was a bad idea. Even if they did send out an SOS to whatever in the hell they came from, it didn't matter. They were going to treat these folks with the same wonderful care that they gave the humans' own allies. And they began to fire without regard to ammo expenditure. They didn't care. Torpedoes, missiles, railguns, coil guns, anything that was ballistic was fired out into the void. Even what they used for planet-based artillery was turned and fired in their direction. The resulting explosions would rip the hull apart of one of these alien vessels and cause it to go adrift. And the whole battle lasted only 21 minutes. At least in space. It would be another 4 minutes before the second line ships were able to jump in, but they would have, saying an easier time about it would be a nice thing, considering there was nothing else left to shoot at them. The human fleet began to move into position to give their folks on the ground more support if they needed some sort of supporting fire, some sort of artillery, or they needed a drop of supplies. They would be easily in position to do so, and to do so very quickly. Though those on the ground did ask for more ammo, they did not ask for more personnel. They locked into a few of the video cameras attached to the suits, and yes, as humanity went, it came to find out that those with 4 arms and 4 legs were actually shorter than humanity themselves. Those humans in their suits would jump up and land on them, crushing them down. It was clear to see that as soon as humanity's soldiers reached in with their hands and ripped open the torso, there was nothing biological inside, except for the fact that it was a type of mechanical organic material that it was made out of. They did find a strange sphere that they found out it was some sort of CPU of some sort. After several of these were simply ripped out and crushed as humanity soldiers hold them up above their head as though holding a heart above their head of their sworn enemy and screaming in rage as they took their vengeance out on these mechanical monstrosities. They were ordered not to destroy them all, as those of higher rank wanted something to be brought home for research. Though they were not going to bring anything back to Earth. It would be researched close by. They still watched as the soldiers of humanity continued their entire vengeance across, And every single time one of the humans came across a torn apart halfling, you could hear it in their voice, the anger swelling up, and no fucks were given after that. Especially when they went to a school looking for survivors, and I don't have to tell you what they found, or the parts of what they found strewn all over the walls, the floor, the ceiling. At that point, the picture of that made its rounds across to all the chains of command, and they simply gave one simple order: kill them all. And they gladly did. The halflings tried to send down their own soldiers in shuttles, but they couldn't get to the front lines fast enough as humanity foregoed their weapons, actually tossed them to the side, and began to go hand to hand with these things. These things may have had energy weapons, but they were not strong enough to get through the synthetic suits that they wore. It simply burned a small piece of the suit itself, but it wasn't strong enough to get through the entire plating. Every time it hit a weak point, a human would yelp in pain, but it did not get through the interior of the suit, as that was designed specifically to stop energy weapons, as that is what they had been facing ever since they had reached the outside of their own cradle world. And with that, the battle was over, and humanity could now salvage what was left of their new enemy. And what they found when they ripped open the ships amazed everyone. Not only were the ships some sort of mechanical, organic something they couldn't figure out, but the entire hull was designed to siphon not only energy weapons, but it seems as though they were designed specifically to use some sort of cosmic radiation, anything that came off of a star, and siphon it into the engines. That was their fuel source. Instead of using quantum energy like humanity does, they're basically solar powered. What the hell? Humanity as a whole didn't understand why one would do this. The only reason you would want to do this is to wrap a star and create a Dyson sphere, which now they had the ability to do if they wanted to. Maybe not a sphere, but a swarm. But why would they? They already have enough energy. They don't need to do anything that extreme. Looking at the soldiers, they realized that these were simple drones. And it wasn't long till they realized that it was a drone fleet itself. But what amazed them the most is when they were finally able to plug into one of those strange spheres, not from one of those soldiers on the ground, no, but one of the CPUs from the ship that they had struck the engine and blown the engine to itty bitty pieces. But when they did, it finally spoke to them. But it only spoke in a strange typing effect. It was strange to hear it just going. And it took the translator a long time to figure out what it was saying. Eventually, it came down to some sort of binary code, but with a twist. It was not two-dimensional. It was actually a trifecta, which surprised the living crap out of everyone. They were able to figure this out, and that was the way they made these computers. They were actually learning computers. They plied the computer with questions, but it was hesitant to give them any answers. Not until it was shut down several times and told that it would be shut down permanently if it didn't answer. For some reason, this biocomputer began to show a type of fear and began to start spitting out all the information it had, where the enemy had come from and why they were there, why they wanted that planet. Well, it turns out that those that had created them were considered the only ones in the universe. And this was not only an assault fleet, but this was a mining fleet. Those creatures that they sent, the four-legged and four-armed ones that they faced, were actually not just an assault force, but they were also going to be used as worker bots. That's the reason why they had 4 limbs on the top and bottom, for stability's sake. That way, if need be, they could simply flip over and use their stronger appendages in one area. They didn't have any concept of up or down unless gravity was attached to it. They would work great in space, as they would simply be able to use thrust vectoring to be able to move in different directions, to be able to carve up different asteroids for materials. For some reason, they wanted this planet. There was a certain type of ore in the planet that they wanted inside the mantle itself. Humanity looked, and sure enough, it was the exact type of ore that created the core of their technology. No wonder they wanted it so bad. But this also came with a question. If this was just a simple mining group, where was their fleet? Did they have a fleet? If they believed they were alone, would they have a military? Were they like us? What did they look like? The machine couldn't give an answer. It told humanity that it was brought online just as the ships were departing. It did not know what their masters actually looked like. It didn't even know where the master's home planet was. They were supposed to bring everything back to a space station. When looking at the schematics, the space station was massive. It was about the size of humanity's moon Luna. This made everyone very nervous, because if they were able to make a space station that large, what would stop them from making ships 10 times larger and easily able to crack a planet in half with a single shot? This was the first time that the Triad got very nervous. Humanity was a little more calm, as they realized they understood this technology far better than they wanted to let on. They realized what it would take to actually do what everyone else feared. One of the commanders spoke out to the entire Triad, "Do not worry, we are here, and humanity protects its own." One of the halflings spoke up, a counselor, one of the direct lines to the Empress. "How can you say that? We are not even the same species. How can you say that we are your own?" With that, the human seemed to grin a little bit, and then, remembering his professional veneer, put his face back to stone and stated, "You were willing to fight alongside us. Yes?" "Yes? Well, I do not understand." "We have brought this up not only to our forearm compatriots here, but to your own folks as well. And you seem to not want to understand it. Those who spill their blood with us shall be our brothers. Not only has our genetic code started to integrate with yours at a very low level." He let this pause for a moment, as this seemed to be a bit of contention among the halflings, as only 2 of their own have been able to either sire or give birth to a mixed breed with a human. "But because of that, you're now part of humanity. And because of that, you're with us." The halflings seemed a little bit more put back. The forearms, though, had a big grin on their face as they realized this. The fertility rates with humans were even worse for them, but it didn't stop them from trying. A lot. In actuality, that was their trade, their main focus of trade with the humans. But it didn't stop things from getting more interesting. More interesting in the fact that now they had an entire universal coalition. They had the Triad with 3 different species, but now the 3 species did not have to worry about going to battle with each other, because nothing brings people together faster than a common enemy. And because of this, the Triad would now become stronger. Now that they had secured the planet, they kept one of the flagships right there. One of these dreadnoughts would always be above the planet, as they knew that the enemy would eventually come to try and retake the planet. there would also be a battle group associated with them that would reach out even farther. Farther, as they would reach out into the stars in the direction in which they believed that the enemy's base was, and they would try to find it. Using quantum entanglement, they would be able to send back instantaneous messages, or maybe delayed by a few moments, to let everyone know where the enemy might be. With this information, everyone got to work. Though the numbers on both sides outside of humanity were low, they immediately went to a wartime footing. They had to understand this from the humans as they realized that they had to adjust their industry more from things like agrarian nature to military. Because of that, each of them had to change the way they think. The Empress of the Halflings was constantly worried about this, as she worried that her own society would change so much that she might be deposed, but they had an enemy to deal with before she would have to worry about that. She did on many occasions try desperately to get humans to integrate into her family. However, she was constantly stopped on this. Main reason as the humans did not want to show favoritism to one side or the other. And a good thing too, because as though the triad was strong and did have a common enemy, the peace was still tenuous at best. The Forearms were still mad at the Halflings for entering their planet, and the Halflings were still mad that they were unable to take down humanity. So tensions were still high. But tensions would remain high for over 2 human years as they all prepared. In that time, humanity built at least one more of their dreadnoughts, along with a whole bunch of other smaller ships, mostly in battleship and cruiser classes. However, the amount of destroyers and frigates could not be underestimated. Many of the technologies that they found from the enemies were used to almost fully automate these ships, leaving each of the destroyers with a crew of 7. 7 personnel was all that was needed, as several of the ships were simply full of automated bots that did most of the maintenance, most of the rearming, and most of the cooking even. This allowed humanity, even though its numbers had not plussed up enough to really take on an enemy as large as they were facing, it allowed them to increase everything 20 to 30 fold. The Halflings were hesitant to do this as they still had a staggeringly large population. However, the Forearms realized that with their limited population, they would require such things to help them out. However, they definitely kept all the automation away from their planet, anything that was of alien origin. If it didn't come directly from the humans, they didn't trust it. Well, from the humans or their own folks. But they were still trying to recover. But eventually, they would get the call. A simple call that changed everything for the foreseeable future. 2 words from the frigate over the stars. Found 'em.